Silas didn't wait for her to set down her bag. He stepped directly into Maeve Hollister's path the moment her boots touched the blackthorn dirt, planted his thumbs in his belt, and looked her up and down the way a man looks at livestock he's already decided isn't worth the feed. Then he turned to the 6 cowboys standing behind him and said it loud enough for every soul in the yard to hear. "Boys, I believe the supply wagon just delivered us a whole lot more than we ordered." The laughter hit like a slap. Maeve stood there dusty from the road, her mother pale and hurting in the wagon seat behind her. Nothing to her name but an old suitcase and a cast-iron skillet she'd wrapped in her spare dress to keep it from clanging, and she felt every ounce of that laughter land exactly where Silas intended it to land. She had heard worse. That was the thing nobody understood about her. She had heard so much worse. This kind of story speaks to you, stories about women who refuse to disappear, who build something real from almost nothing. Then hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The town of Harlan Crossing, Texas had a way of deciding who a person was before that person ever opened their mouth. It decided based on what they wore, who they'd married, how much land their family held, and if you happened to be a woman on the precise shape of your body and the rumors that followed you down the road. Maeve Hollister had been decided on a long time ago. She was 32 years old, and she weighed close to 220 pounds. And there were people in 3 counties who could tell you that number with more confidence. Then they could tell you the price of beef or the name of the current governor. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned back, because loose hair had no place in a working kitchen, and she had green eyes that caught light in a way that made some people uncomfortable, like they hadn't expected someone who looked like her to have eyes that direct. Her husband, Thomas Hollister, had died 14 months ago, under circumstances that were still being discussed in parlors and on front porches, with the kind of enthusiasm people reserve for stories they can improve upon each telling. Thomas had been a drinker and a gambler, and a man who died with more debt than dignity, and somehow in the way these things always seem to go, his failures had become Maeve's fault. She had driven him to drink. She had spent his money. She had, according to at least 4 women in Harlan Crossing, who had appointed themselves the region's moral authorities, lured Thomas Hollister into a marriage he was never suited for, and whatever had happened afterward was simply what happened to women like her. Women like her. Maeve had spent a year figuring out what to do with that phrase. She'd been trying to keep her mother, Lenora, housed and fed. Lenora had fallen the previous winter, and her hip had never healed right, which meant she moved slowly and tired quickly and needed more care than Maeve could provide, while also working the 2 part-time jobs she'd scraped together after Thomas's creditors took most of what he'd left behind. One of those jobs had disappeared when the hotel where she'd been doing laundry changed hands. The other had disappeared when the new owner's wife decided she didn't want a woman of Maeve's reputation and Maeve's figure working around her husband. So Maeve had done the only practical thing left to do. She had heard that Blackthorn Ranch was looking for a cook. She had heard it paid $30 a month, which was more than she'd made in any 2 months combined since Thomas died. She had packed what she owned, helped her mother into the wagon seat, and driven 40 miles on a road that turned to mud twice before it turned to dust. She had arrived at the gate of the largest working cattle ranch in the territory with her skillet wrapped in her dress and nothing in her chest but the particular kind of stubborn that grows in a person once they've run out of options and fear at roughly the same time. That was when Silas Vane stepped in front of her. He was a big man, Silas, wide through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that made up the territory's creek beds. He had been at Blackthorn for 6 years, and he ran the bunkhouse the way certain men run bunkhouses, through a combination of physical dominance, strategic cruelty, and an ability to make younger hands feel that his approval was something worth earning. The cowboys around him had taken their cues from him for so long that most of them didn't even notice they were doing it anymore. "Seriously now," Silas said, still performing for his audience. "Who sent for this? Because I'm pretty sure we put in for a cook, not a Silas." The voice came from the direction of the main house, and it had the quality of a hand laid flat on a table. Not loud, not theatrical, just final. Ransom Creed walked across the yard with the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have never needed to hurry because the work waits for them rather than the other way around. He was 38, lean without being thin, with the kind of face that had started out handsome and then gotten weathered into something more interesting. He wore no hat at the moment. His dark hair was pushed back from his forehead, and there was a crease along his jaw from where he'd been lying on something, which meant she had woken him up from what was probably the first rest he'd taken in days. He looked at Silas first. Then he looked at Maeve. Not the way Silas had looked at her. Not an assessment of weight and worthiness. He looked at her the way someone looks when they're trying to read the important parts of a situation quickly. And the important parts to Ransom Creed were apparently her hands, which were strong and rough from work, and her eyes, which were not scared, and the cast iron skillet visible through the gap in her suitcase, which he noticed the way a practical man notices the tools another person carries. "Mrs. Hollister," he said. "That's right. You've come about the cook position." "I have." Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Boss, you can't be serious." Ransom didn't look at him. "You have somewhere to be, Silas?" A beat. The kind of silence in which a man recalibrates. "No, sir." "Then make yourself useful." Ransom finally moved his eyes away from Maeve and turned toward the wagon. He saw Lenora sitting there, one hand braced against the wagon board, her face the color of old wax. "Is that your mother?" "It is." "She's been unwell." "I was hoping." "There's a small room off the kitchen storage. It's not much, but it's separate, and it has a cot. She can stay there while you're working." He said it without ceremony, like it was a practical detail rather than a kindness. And something about that was more settling to Maeve than if he'd made a performance of generosity. "Come up to the house when you're ready. I'll show you the kitchen." He walked back toward the main house. Silas watched him go. Then he looked at Maeve with an expression that had moved past mockery into something cooler and more deliberate. 30 days, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "That's what he's giving you. 30 days. And I'll tell you now, every cook before you lasted less than 2 weeks. This kitchen'll break you before the work does." Maeve looked at him steadily. "Then I guess we'll find out." She picked up her suitcase. She helped her mother down from the wagon, and she walked toward the main house without looking back. The Blackthorn kitchen was a disaster. Not a dramatic, spectacular disaster. Worse than that, it was the kind of disaster that had accumulated slowly, layer by layer, like years of neglect that had been papered over with just enough function to keep people from dealing with it. The shelves were warped. The dry goods were stored in whatever containers had been available rather than anything sensible, which meant flour was in a cracked crock next to a barrel that smelled of old onions, and the cornmeal had been left in a sack that something had gotten into. The wood stove had a baffle problem that would fill the room with smoke every time the wind came from the southwest. 2 of the hanging pots had handles that were one hard lift away from separating entirely. Ransom stood in the doorway while she looked at it. "I know," he said. "Do you want me to tell you what needs fixing, or do you want me to just fix it?" He considered that. "How long to fix it? Depends on what you can get me. Give me a list of what's available in town and what you're willing to spend, and I'll tell you what I can do with it. I'll have my foreman put together numbers." "Not your foreman," Maeve said. "I'll want to talk to whoever handles the supply orders. Directly." Something shifted in his expression, not offense. More like recalibration. "That would be Silas." Of course it was. "Then Silas and I need to have a conversation." Ransom leaned against the doorframe. "Silas has been managing supplies for 3 years. And how's that been working out?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "I'll arrange it," Ransom said. He arranged it. Silas sat across the kitchen table from Maeve that afternoon, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the energy of a man who had decided in advance that whatever she said was going to be wrong. He had a ledger with him. Maeve had a pencil and a piece of paper she'd found in the kitchen drawer. She asked him about the suppliers. She asked about the prices. She asked which merchants they'd been using and for how long and what the delivery schedule looked like. Silas answered with the minimum number of words possible, and each answer had a little barb in it, a slight hesitation, a tone that suggested she wouldn't understand the answer anyway, an occasional glance toward the door, as if he was waiting for someone to come in and tell him he didn't have to do this. But he answered. And as he answered, Maeve wrote things down. By the time they were done, She had enough to see that the prices Blackthorn was paying for staple goods were 15 to 20% higher than what she knew those goods actually cost. Not dramatically higher, subtly higher. The kind of higher that a busy man running a large ranch might not notice unless he was the kind of person who paid close attention to flour prices, which Ransom Creed apparently was not. She didn't say anything about it. Not yet. She filed it away in the back of her mind, the particular storage space she kept, for things that needed more information, before she knew what to do with them, and she started making a list of what she actually needed. The first morning was brutal. She was up before 4. Kitchen was cold. The stove needed 20 minutes of coaxing before it would hold a proper heat, and she burned her left forearm on the baffle she hadn't yet figured out how to properly manage. She had 46 men to feed breakfast before first light, and the previous cook had left her a pantry that contained roughly enough ingredients for a decent meal for 15. She made it work. She made it work with cornmeal mush that she salted and seasoned until it was worth eating, and with the salt pork she'd found in the back of the cold storage that was still good if you cut it right, and with biscuits she started at 3:30 because she knew they'd take time. They weren't her best biscuits. She'd made better when she had better ingredients. But they were hot, and there were enough of them. And when the first wave of cowboys came through the door at 5 in the morning, expecting to find the usual mediocrity, they found instead a table that had been set with actual consideration plates in their places. Coffee ready, food coming out in a sequence that made sense. Silas was in the third wave. He sat down. He looked at his plate. He looked at Maeve, who was moving between the stove and the table without looking at anyone in particular. Then he looked back at his plate. He didn't say anything. He just ate, which was, Maeve had learned long ago, as close to a first concession as men like Silas usually got. By the end of the first week, she had established 3 things. First, the kitchen could be managed efficiently if organized correctly, which it now was. She had reorganized the storage, labeled the containers, fixed the 2 dangerous pot handles with wire she'd found in the barn, and a technique her mother had taught her, and identified exactly which way the wind needed to blow to make the stove baffle a problem, so she could compensate before it became one. Second, the vegetable garden behind the kitchen, which had been written off as a lost cause, was not actually a lost cause. It was a neglected cause, which is different. There was still life in that soil. It needed work and water and attention, and Maeve intended to give it all 3. Third, Blackthorn's food costs were going to drop once she established her own supplier relationships, and she had already sent a letter to a farmer named Gustavo Reyes, who operated 12 miles west, and who, according to information she'd gathered from the cowboys, over meals people talk when they're comfortable, and fed sold produce at fair prices to anyone who came to him directly rather than through an intermediary. She hadn't told Silas about Gustavo Reyes. She'd thought about it. She'd decided against it. Something about the way his eyes had moved when she'd asked about the supply costs. A flicker of something that wasn't just irritation at being questioned. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, more like concern. Ransom Creed ate in the main house separately from his men, which was a rancher's prerogative, but he had a habit of appearing in the kitchen in the late evenings, ostensibly to check on things, but actually, Maeve suspected, because he didn't have much else to do with himself in the hours after work ended and before sleep came. He was one of those men who didn't know what to do with stillness. She recognized the type. Thomas had been the same way, though Thomas had found whiskey as his solution, which was not a solution at all. Ransom's solution was to stand in doorways and ask questions. The men seemed different at breakfast, he said, one evening at the end of her second week. Maeve was scrubbing the large pot. Different how? Less, he searched for the word. Less sour. Vance told me yesterday that he hadn't eaten a hot meal before sunrise since his mother used to cook for him when he was 14. Vance is from Arkansas, Maeve said. He has a problem with his right hand. The grip is weakening. He tries to hide it. He needs food that doesn't require much cutting or tearing. So I've been adjusting his portions. Ransom looked at her for a moment. How do you know about his hand? I watch people when I serve them. It's hard not to notice things when you're the one putting the plate down. He hasn't told me. He's not going to tell you. He's afraid you'll put him on lighter work and dock his pay. He's got a wife and 2 boys in Abilene. Another pause. Ransom moved into the kitchen properly now, which he hadn't done before. He'd always stayed in the doorway. He pulled out a chair and sat down, Not at the head of the table, but somewhere in the middle, the way someone sits when they're not trying to be in charge of the moment. "What else have you noticed?" he asked. She told him about young Danny Pruitt, who was 17 and couldn't read, and was humiliated by it, and had been hiding it with careful performance for months. She told him about Hector Garza, who was 61 and couldn't keep pace with the younger men on the heavy drive work and had been quietly eating less at meals because he'd decided he hadn't earned his full portion. "That stops now," Ransom said, when she got to Hector. His voice had an edge to it that wasn't anger at her. "I've already been making sure he gets an extra portion at the end of service," Maeve said. "I told him it was leftovers that would go to waste." Ransom was quiet for a long moment. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "That's right. You know more about what's happening in that bunkhouse than I've known in 3 years. Maeve set down the scrub brush and turned to look at him. "With respect, Mr. Creed, you've been looking at what's in the field. I've been looking at what's at the table. You see different things from different positions." He nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. Like she was. The confrontation with Silas came at the end of the 3rd week, and it came, like most confrontations do, without the warning she would have preferred. She had been to Gustavo Reyes twice by then. The produce was good, the prices were fair, and Gustavo had introduced her to 2 other local farmers who could supplement what he couldn't supply. Her first month's food costs were going to come in nearly $18 under what the previous cook had spent. On a ranch Blackthorn's size, that was the kind of number that made a difference. She'd shown the numbers to Ransom without editorializing, just laid them on the table in front of him. He'd looked at them for a long time. "Where's this difference coming from?" he'd asked. "New suppliers," she'd said. "Local direct. Cuts out the intermediary." Another long look. Who was the intermediary before? "The invoices come through Orson Pike's merchant operation." Something moved across Ransom's face, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like a suspicion that had been sitting quietly in a corner just got a reason to stand up. "Pike handles a good portion of the territory supply contracts." "I know, he's good at what he does." She hadn't said anything else. She didn't need to. Silas found her the next morning before breakfast service. He came into the kitchen when she was still alone, still getting the stove to temperature, and he didn't knock or make any announcement. He just appeared in the back doorway with his arms crossed and his face doing something she'd seen before on men who had decided that a quiet, targeted cruelty would work better than a frontal approach. "Heard you've been going around the usual supply arrangements," he said. "I've been finding better prices for the ranch. That's my job." "Your job," Silas said, "is to cook food, not to go digging around in arrangements that were working fine." "For who?" Maeve said. She didn't turn around from the stove. "For everyone." The ranch was paying $18 a month more than it needed to. "That's not working fine for Blackthorn. That's working fine for someone else." Silence. She heard him take a step into the kitchen. "Let me tell you something," Silas said. His voice had dropped, now, into the register where men put things they want you to understand are serious. "You've had a nice run here. A few weeks. Nobody's pushed you out. You're feeling like maybe you've got some ground under you. But this is a cattle ranch, Mrs. Hollister. The men who actually do the work here have been doing it a long time. And we don't need some widow who walked in off the road thinking she understands how things operate." Maeve turned around. She looked at him steadily. He was bigger than her. He was physically intimidating in a way she was not unaware of. And there was something in his face now that was past professional irritation, something that looked, if she was right, like genuine fear dressed up as aggression. "I haven't said a word to Mr. Creed about the supply discrepancy," she said. "I showed him the numbers. I let him draw his own conclusions. That's what I'll keep doing." "Back off the suppliers," Silas said. "Stick to your kitchen." "Mr. Vane," Maeve said. "I've been talked at by men who thought they were frightening me for about the last 15 years. Still here." She picked up the scrub brush and turned back to the stove. "Breakfast starts in 40 minutes. Unless you're planning to cook it yourself, you might want to clear my workspace." He stood there for another 10 seconds. Then he left. She found the discrepancy on a Tuesday. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd been cross-referencing 3 months of invoices against what she knew the goods actually cost something she'd been doing methodically in the evenings, the way she did most things that mattered to her, slowly and without announcing it, and there it was. Not one large discrepancy, a series of small ones. Pike's invoices for beef tallow, for salt, for bulk flour, for lamp oil. Each one slightly inflated, the kind of slightly that was easy to miss unless you were looking at all of them together and comparing them to market prices. And not just inflated on one invoice, inflated consistently. Same pattern across 3 years of records that she'd quietly borrowed from the household file. Ransom kept in the study, which he'd given her access to when she'd asked if she could review the kitchen budget history. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and she looked at those numbers for a long time. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a financier. But she had been managing a household budget since she was 16 years old, and she knew what consistent meant. Consistent wasn't a mistake. Consistent was a decision. She wrote everything down on clean paper, in her careful hand, the kind of methodical specificity that came from years of keeping records, because you knew there would come a time when someone tried to tell you what had or hadn't happened, and you wanted to be able to show them exactly what the reality was. She put the papers in the same drawer where she kept her personal documents, underneath the extra flour sack. Then she went to bed, because breakfast was in 5 hours, and the stove still needed work before it would hold an even heat through the morning. Ransom left for the major cattle drive on a Monday in late September. He told her before he left, came into the kitchen the evening before, stood in his usual spot near the wall, and said he'd be gone at least 3 weeks, maybe 4. "You'll have what you need?" he asked. "I've got the supply routes established. I know what's coming when." She paused. "Who's in charge while you're gone?" "Foreman's name is Webb." "Good man. Silas handles the supply logistics." She nodded. Ransom looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Anything you need before I go?" She almost told him then. She almost took out the papers from the drawer in her mind and laid them out on the table between them. But she didn't have enough yet. She had numbers on paper. What she didn't have was the connection between those numbers and Silas, the actual mechanism of how the money moved, who received what the arrangement looked like. Without that, she had a suspicion. Suspicions were not protection. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded. He left the next morning before she'd finished the breakfast service. The rumors started on the 4th day after he left. She heard them first from Danny Pruitt, who came into the kitchen after supper, looking like he'd swallowed something uncomfortable, and didn't know whether to pretend he hadn't. "Some of the boys are saying things," Danny said. "Maeve didn't stop washing the dishes." "What kind of things?" "About you and Mr. Creed." He shifted. "About why you're still here, when nobody else lasted." She waited. "They're saying he stopped," Silas is saying. "That you've been working on Mr. Creed, that you've got some kind of hold on him, that you're after his money, and you've been managing him since the first day." The dishwater was hot. She kept her hands in it. "And you?" she said. "What do you think?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "I think you taught me how to figure sums without making me feel stupid about it," he said finally. "And I think the food here's better than it's ever been, and I've been here 8 months." He paused. "But I thought you should know what's being said." "I appreciate that, Danny." After he left, she stood at the sink for a moment, with her hands still in the water. She had heard this kind of thing before. The shape of it was familiar, the way a woman who did something that worked, who made herself useful in a way that couldn't be ignored, became automatically suspicious. What was her angle? What was she really after? Because surely it couldn't just be what it looked like. She dried her hands. She thought about leaving. She thought about it the way you think about an option you've already ruled out, just enough to confirm it's still ruled out. Then she went to the drawer and took out her papers and sat down at the kitchen table and went back to work. Because Silas had just made a very specific miscalculation. He had assumed that rumors were something she'd run from. He'd forgotten, or he'd never understood, that a woman who had already survived the complete destruction of her reputation and had nothing left to lose was not a woman who could be threatened with the loss of her reputation. What she could lose was this job, this income, this roof over her mother's head, and she was not going to let that happen. She picked up her pencil, kept writing. The papers in her drawer grew thicker every evening. Maeve had developed a system. After the supper dishes were done and the kitchen was set for morning fire banked, bread sponge started if it was a bread day, the large pots scrubbed and hung. She would sit at the kitchen table, with the lamp pulled close, and she would work through whatever records she'd been able to get her hands on that day. She wasn't taking anything that didn't belong to her. Ransom had given her access to the kitchen budget files, and she had extended that access. Carefully, logically, to adjacent records, the supply ledgers, the quarterly expense tallies, the invoice files that Webb the foreman kept in a wooden crate in the ranch office, and which he had no particular interest in reviewing himself because Webb was a cattleman, and cattlemen thought about cattle. Pattern in the numbers was becoming clearer the more she looked at it. Pike's invoices had a rhythm, not the rhythm of a merchant responding to market prices, which moved up and down with seasons and supply. Pike's invoices moved in one direction only, upward, and they moved in increments, small enough that no single invoice would trigger alarm, but large enough that across 3 years and across all the supply categories, the accumulated overcharge was something in the neighborhood of $400, maybe more. She wasn't finished adding. $400 was what a working cowboy made in well over a year. She wrote it down. She kept writing. Outside, the ranch had gone quiet the way it did. After 9 in the evening, the particular silence of 46 tired men who had been awake since before dawn and would be awake again before dawn and had nothing left in them for conversation or mischief. Occasionally, she heard one of the horses moving in the near barn. Once, a coyote started up somewhere to the south and then stopped abruptly, like it had thought better of it. Lenora appeared in the doorway of her small room, moving carefully on her bad hip, wrapped in the quilt Maeve had found in the storage chest. "You should sleep," Lenora said. "I will. You said that an hour ago." Maeve looked up. Her mother's face in the lamplight was the same face it had always been, sharp-featured, observant, the face of a woman who had survived enough to know when worry was appropriate and when it was wasted energy. Right now it was doing both. "Sit down, Mama. Don't stand on that hip." Lenora sat. She looked at the papers spread across the table. She had always been able to read a situation the way some people read weather, not from individual details, but from the overall feel of the air. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Maeve said. "For Pike. Not for us. Not yet. Silas knows you're looking. Silas knows I've found different suppliers. He doesn't know how far back I've gone." Maeve set down her pencil and rubbed her eyes. "He thinks I'm a cook who got lucky with some farmers. He doesn't think I can read a ledger. Most people don't think you can do most of what you do," Lenora said without bitterness. "Just stating a fact. Has that ever stopped you?" Maeve almost smiled. "Go back to bed, Mama. I'm going." Lenora pushed herself up, steadied on the table edge, then stopped. "That man, Creed. He left you here alone with Silas on purpose?" "He left because he had a cattle drive. 30 head going north. That's his livelihood. He doesn't know what Silas is. Expect something. He just doesn't know what shape it takes yet." Maeve straightened her papers. "When he gets back, he'll know." Lenora looked at her for a moment. "You're building a case. I'm keeping records. There's a difference." But they both understood there wasn't much of one. The next morning, something shifted in the bunkhouse, and Maeve felt it before she understood it. It was in the way the men came through the breakfast line. Not the usual shuffle and reach and half-awake mumbling. There were glances. Not at her directly, sideways glances, the kind that happen when people are trying to see whether you've noticed something yet. Young Danny Pruitt wouldn't meet her eyes. Hector Garza, who usually had a quiet word for her when he came through, kept his face toward his plate. She served breakfast the way she always served it. Hot, consistent, enough for everyone. She didn't ask questions. She watched. It was Vance who finally said something. And he said it because Vance was from Arkansas, and Arkansans, in Maeve's experience, tended toward direct speech when they were uncomfortable, because discomfort made them fidget and fidgeting made them talk. He waited until most of the other men had gone back out, and then he turned back from the door and said, "Mrs. Hollister, I want you to know I didn't say anything to anybody." "About what?" Vance looked at the floor. Silas was asking last night. "About what you and Mr. Creed talk about when he comes in here evenings. Whether you've been," he stopped. Started again. "Whether you've been asking about the ranch finances. Whether Mr. Creed shows you the account books." Maeve set down the ladle she was holding. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." "Which is true. I don't know what you talk about." Vance paused. "But I didn't tell him that you and Mr. Creed have been talking most evenings. I figured that wasn't his business." He shifted his weight. "His hand, right? You know about his hand. You adjust my plate." He said it quietly. Not as leverage. As an explanation for why he'd made the choice he'd made. Maeve looked at him. Vance was maybe 50, with a face that had spent a lot of years in direct sun, and his right hand, she noticed as she always noticed, was curved slightly inward when he wasn't thinking about it. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded once and went back out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. Silas was doing reconnaissance. That was what that was. Trying to establish what she'd told Ransom and how much Ransom knew before he figured out his next move, which meant he was worried, which meant she was closer to something than she'd realized. She went back to her work. The supply wagon from Pike's operation arrived on a Thursday 2 weeks into Ransom's absence. It was driven by a boy of about 16 who clearly had no stake in anything beyond getting his wagon unloaded and getting back on the road, and he handed Maeve the invoice without looking at it first, which meant he hadn't been coached on what she might say about it. She looked at the invoice. The price for the salt pork was wrong. Not subtly wrong, significantly wrong. By nearly 30% above the market rate she now knew from her own supplier conversations. And this was a delivery she hadn't ordered. She had her own salt pork arrangement established with a farm operation west of Harlan Crossing. She hadn't canceled the Pike contract formally, because she'd been waiting, because timing mattered, but she had reduced Blackthorn's Pike orders to nearly nothing over the previous 6 weeks, except this order, which had apparently been placed by someone else. "Who authorized this delivery?" she asked the boy. He shrugged. "Man at the merchant office said it was the standing order. I just drive." She looked at the invoice again. "I'm going to need you to take this back." The boy blinked. "Ma'am, I'm not signing for a delivery I didn't order at prices I didn't agree to. You can take it back, or you can leave it here unsigned and tell Mr. Pike that Mrs. Hollister would like to speak with him directly about the arrangement going forward. Either way works." The boy looked genuinely alarmed, the way 16-year-olds look when a situation has gone outside the range of what they were briefed to handle. "I can't take it back. There's nowhere to put it on the road." "Then unload it and I'll hold it unsigned." She handed the invoice back to him. "But I'm not signing this." He unloaded it. He left with the unsigned invoice in his hand and the expression of someone who was going to have a very uncomfortable conversation on the other end of his route. Silas appeared around the corner of the barn approximately 4 minutes later, which told her he'd been watching. "You refused the Pike delivery," he said. "I refused to sign an invoice for a delivery I didn't authorize at prices I didn't approve." She turned to go back inside. "If there's a standing order with Pike that I wasn't made aware of, that needs to go to Webb, or wait for Mr. Creed to get back. You don't have authority to cancel standing supply arrangements." Maeve stopped, turned back around. "Mr. Vane, I have authority over what comes into this kitchen and what gets paid for from the kitchen budget. That was established when Mr. Creed hired me. If someone placed a supply order outside of my knowledge, that's not a kitchen decision, that's a ranch administration decision. And it's not mine to sign for. You're creating problems with Pike. Pike's prices are creating problems with Pike." She held his gaze. "You've been managing the supply orders for 3 years. You know what his prices look like. You know what the market rate is. So do I." A pause. "The question of how that gap has existed for this long is an interesting one." His jaw tightened. She went back inside. Her hands were not quite steady when she started the midday prep. That happened sometimes, the adrenaline of a confrontation working itself out through her hands before her head had caught up with the fact that it was over. She focused on the knife work. Steady, deliberate, one thing at a time. She didn't sleep well that Thursday night. Not from fear. She'd been past fear for a while now, or at least past the kind of fear that paralyzed. What kept her awake was the weight of the decision she'd been sitting with for days, which was simply, when was the right moment to take what she knew to someone who could act on it? She thought about Webb. Webb was decent enough, but Webb had no interest in supply ledgers and no particular loyalty to her specifically. He'd tell Silas she'd come to him, and then she'd have lost the element of the one thing she had going for her, which was that Silas didn't know how much she knew. She thought about writing to Ransom directly, wherever the drive had gotten to. She'd sent a letter once before, about a maintenance issue, and Webb had told her the best mail drop was a town called Claraville, 2 days' ride east. But a letter that took 4 days to reach him, and 4 days for any response, was not the tool she needed right now. She needed Ransom back. In the meantime, she needed to keep Silas uncertain and keep herself building the record. She got up at 3:30 and started the bread. There was something clarifying about bread work before dawn. The repetitive press and fold of the dough, the way the kitchen filled slowly with warmth as the stove found its temperature. She had been baking bread since she was 11 years old, and the muscle memory of it lived somewhere deeper than thought, which meant her hands could work, while her mind did something else. What her mind was doing was running through every conversation she'd had with Ransom in those evening visits. What he'd said, what she'd noticed about how he processed information. He was not an impulsive man. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of man who needed to see something clearly before he acted on it. But once he saw it, he didn't equivocate. That was what she needed from him. Not protection, exactly. Authority. The authority that came with his name and his standing in the territory, which was the thing she couldn't manufacture on her own. She worked the dough. She waited. The shift in the bunkhouse came gradually, the way most real shifts do, not like a door opening but like light changing. So slowly you don't notice until the room is different from what it was. It started with Danny Pruitt and the arithmetic. She had been working with Danny in the evenings, informally, not calling it teaching because he'd have been too embarrassed to accept it if she had. She'd just started asking him to help her measure and calculate how much flour for 46 men at this biscuit size, how many pounds of salt pork at this ratio, and she'd been correcting his counting without ceremony. Just doing the sum alongside him and letting him see where his answer and her answer diverged. He was quick, Danny. Once he understood the shape of a problem, he held it. After 3 weeks of these incidental lessons, he could do the morning calculations faster than she could. One evening, he stayed after the other hands had gone and looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. "I want to learn to read the whole ledger," he said. "Not just the numbers, the words too." Maeve looked at him for a moment. He was 17, and he had the particular shame of someone who has been carrying a secret he's convinced makes him less than other people. It sat right there on his face, undisguised. "That's a longer project," she said. "I know. We'd have to work at it a while. I'm not going anywhere," Danny said. So they started. 20 minutes at a time in the kitchen after supper, while she did the last of the cleaning up. She used the labels on the supply containers, because those were right there, and he knew what the contents were, which gave him a foothold. She used the simple column headers in her own records, kept the humiliation quotient of the process at 0, which was the most important element of teaching someone, something they're ashamed of not knowing. The other men noticed Danny staying after supper. They didn't ask directly, cowboys rarely did, but Maeve could feel the slight adjustment in how some of them looked at her. Not the assessment look that had been there in the beginning. Something more like curiosity, like they were recalculating something and hadn't finished yet. Old Hector Garza said something to her one morning, quietly, when the breakfast rush had cleared, and he was the last man at the table. "You know what I heard," he said. "I heard you've been sending money north to put up a widow woman and her children in Claraville. A woman from a ranch that went under." Maeve paused. "Where'd you hear that?" "Word gets around." He looked at his coffee. "I heard you took $5 from your own pay and gave it to Webb to pass along." He looked up at her then. "That true?" She had done that. She had done it because Webb had mentioned, offhandedly, that a woman named Clara Briggs, whose husband had died in a fence line accident 2 months back, was in a bad situation with 3 children and no family in the territory. Maeve had thought about it for one day, and then taken $5 from the small envelope, where she kept her monthly pay, and given it to Webb without making anything of it. She had not expected anyone to know. "It's not much," she said. "To her it probably is," Hector said. He looked back at his coffee. "I just wanted you to know I know. That's all." He got up slowly, the way men with aging joints get up, careful and deliberate. He nodded once and walked out. Maeve stood in the kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular warmth of being seen accurately by someone who didn't owe her anything. She gave herself about 30 seconds of that. Then she went back to work. Orson Pike came to Blackthorn in person on a Monday. She saw the buggy from the kitchen window, a good buggy, better than most, that came down the ranch road, with matched bay horses that had been groomed to show. The man who climbed down from it was in his 50s, heavy-set in a way that spoke of prosperity rather than labor, with a coat that was 2 grades better than anyone else in Harlan Crossing wore for ordinary business. He had the face of someone who had practiced being reasonable for so long it had calcified into a permanent expression. He didn't come to the kitchen. He went to the ranch office, where Webb was, And Maeve learned from Danny, who had been crossing the yard, and absorbed conversations the way teenagers absorb things. They're pretending not to notice that Pike had expressed concerns about the changes in Blackthorn's supply arrangements and wanted to discuss continuity of service. Webb was not equipped for this conversation. Webb was a cattleman. He told Pike that the kitchen arrangements were Mrs. Hollister's domain and he'd have to take it up with her. Pike came to the kitchen 20 minutes later. He was polite. That was the first thing she noted. He introduced himself with the full formal courtesy of a man who has built his business on the appearance of respectability, and he sat down at the kitchen table when she offered it, and he accepted the coffee she poured, because refusing it would have been impolite, and impolite was not what he was here to be. "Mrs. Hollister," he said, "I understand you've been making changes to Blackthorn's purchasing arrangements." "I've been finding better prices for the ranch," she said. "Part of my job." "Of course." The smile was practiced. "I want to make sure there hasn't been any misunderstanding about the value of the existing relationship. Blackthorn has been a priority account for my operation for 3 years. Priority accounts receive Mr. Pike," Maeve said. "I've looked at 3 years of invoices. The prices Blackthorn has been paying for standard staple goods are consistently 15 to 20% above market rate." She kept her voice level. Informational. Not accusatory, not yet, not here, not without ransom. Whatever value the existing relationship provided, it appears to have flowed primarily in one direction. Practiced smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Market prices fluctuate," he said. "They do, but not consistently upward, and not consistently in the same increments, and not with the same pattern across all product categories at the same time." She picked up her coffee cup. "I was a household manager for 11 years before I came to Blackthorn. I know what supply ledgers look like when prices are moving with the market, and I know what they look like when they're being managed." She met his eyes. "Yours look like the second thing. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has texture. I'd be careful," Pike said, finally, "about making accusations that are difficult to support." "I haven't made an accusation. I've described what the numbers look like." She set down her cup. "When Mr. Creed returns from the drive, he'll review the full account history. At that point, if there are questions about the supply arrangements, I'm sure they'll be resolved appropriately." Pike stood up. The practiced smile was gone now. What was underneath it was harder and less pleasant. "You're new here, Mrs. Hollister. You don't know yet how things work in this territory." "I'm learning," Maeve said. He left. She watched from the window as he climbed back into his good buggy and drove back down the ranch road with his matched bay horses. And she thought about the expression on his face in the moment before he'd stood up the assessment look, measuring what she was, deciding what she was worth as an obstacle. She picked up her pencil. She kept writing. The rumors changed shape that week. The first version had been about Maeve's motives. She was manipulating Ransom. She was after his money. She had some kind of hold on him. That version had circulated through the bunkhouse and hadn't quite caught fire the way Silas had presumably hoped, probably because the men who worked and ate alongside Maeve every day had a hard time reconciling the woman who adjusted Vance's plate and taught Danny to read with the calculating schemer the rumor required. So the second version was different, more targeted. The second version involved Maeve's past. Specifically, the circumstances around Thomas Hollister's death. She heard it from Lenora first, who had heard it from the wife of a neighboring ranch hand, who'd come by to return a borrowed pot. In this version, Thomas hadn't simply died of his own poor choices and excessive drink. In this version, Maeve had been involved. The details were vague because details in this kind of story are always vague. Vagueness was structural, because specific claims could be disproven and vague ones couldn't. But the shape of it was, Thomas had died under suspicious circumstances. There had been talk at the time, and a woman who'd survived that under suspicious circumstances was not a woman who should be trusted around a wealthy rancher's finances. Maeve sat at the kitchen table and listened to her mother tell her this with a face that didn't move. "It's Pike," she said when Lenora finished. "Probably. But Silas is the one spreading it." "Yes." Maeve folded her hands on the table. "Thomas drank himself to death over 14 months after a bad debt cycle he started before I married him. The doctor in Harlan Crossing signed the death certificate. There was an inquest, because there's always an inquest when a man dies young and owes money, and the inquest found nothing because there was nothing to find." She looked at her mother. "They know that." This isn't about what happened to Thomas. It's about what people might believe if it gets said the right way. Lenora's jaw was tight. What are you going to do? Nothing, Maeve said. Her mother blinked. Nothing? If I respond to it, I'm validating it. If I go to Webb and ask him to do something about it, I look frightened, and I put Webb in the middle of something that isn't his to resolve. She picked up her pencil. Ransom will be back in 8 days. I have 8 days of work left to do. When he's back, I'll show him what I have and let it speak for itself. Lenora looked at her for a long moment. You have your father's stubbornness. I have my mother's patience, Maeve said. They're different things. Lenora made a sound that might have been a laugh. She went back to her room. Maeve worked until 2 in the morning. Ransom came back on a Wednesday, and he came back 6 days earlier than expected. She heard the horses in the yard and looked out and saw him dismounting in the gray early light, still trail dusty, moving like a man who hadn't slept horizontally in too long. She was already 3 hours into the morning prep. The bread was done. The salt pork was crisping in the second pan. He came through the kitchen door without knocking, which he never did, and stopped when he saw her, turned from the stove. He looked at her face for a moment, just a moment, but long enough that she understood he'd heard something on the road, or received a letter, or both. His expression was contained in the way Ransom's expressions were usually contained, but underneath the containment, there was something that looked like controlled anger, and she didn't think it was directed at her. What happened? He said. Good morning to you too, Mr. Creed. He almost managed a half smile. What happened while I was gone? She wiped her hands on her apron. I have something I need to show you. Can you give me an hour to get breakfast on the table? Can it wait an hour? The men need to eat, she said. And you look like you could use something yourself. Sit down. He sat down, which surprised her. She put a plate in front of him, the same plate she'd put in front of everyone else, because she didn't have the time or the inclination to make a special circumstance of it, and she went back to the service. She watched him eat from the corner of her eye. He ate like a man who'd been on trail food for 3 weeks, which was to say quickly and without waste. When the last cowboy had come through and the serving was done and the kitchen had cleared, Ransom was still at the table with his coffee. She went to the drawer. She took out the papers. She set them on the table in front of him. He looked at her, then at the papers. I've been keeping records, she said. Go through them, and I'll answer whatever questions you have. He went through them. It took him 20 minutes. He was methodical about it, not the way she was methodical, which was instinctive, but the way a man who runs a large operation is methodical, going back to cross-reference things against other pages, checking dates against dates. He asked her 2 questions while he was reading, both specific and practical, and she answered them. When he was done, he set the last page down and looked at the table surface for a moment. How long have you known? He said. I started suspecting around the end of my first week. I had enough to be certain at about 4 weeks. I've been building the full picture since then. Why didn't you tell me before I left? Because suspicion isn't evidence. I needed enough to show you something complete, not just point at a number and say it looks wrong. She paused, and because I wanted to be sure about Silas before I said his name. You'd had him here 6 years. That's not something you dismantle on my word alone. Ransom was quiet for a long moment. The rumors, he said. About you. I heard some of it in Claraville from a man who'd come through from here. About Thomas. Yes. His voice was flat. I know what happened with Thomas, Mrs. Hollister. I did some checking before I hired you. The inquest finding is a matter of public record. He looked up at her. I hired you knowing your history. She hadn't known that. She'd assumed he'd hired her on the 30-day gamble basis she'd presented herself as. The information rearranged something small but significant in how she understood the previous weeks. Then you know the rumors are Silas covering his position, she said. Yes, he stood up. He picked up the papers she'd compiled. I'm going to need these. I have a copy. He stopped. Looked at her. I always keep a copy, she said. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite surprise, but was somewhere between the two. Of course you do. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The drive went well. The herd came in at a better price than I expected. He said it like he was trying to offer her something and wasn't sure how. Good, she said. That's good. We're going to need to deal with Pike and Silas before this gets further than it already has. I know. That's going to be ugly. I know that too. She picked up the next pot and moved to the sink. Ugly doesn't mean wrong. Ransom stood in the doorway for another beat. No, he said. It doesn't. He went out. Maeve ran the water and started the washing up. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt like the ground under her feet was solid enough to stand on. Ransom didn't wait until morning to deal with Silas. Maeve heard it from the kitchen, not the words, because the ranch office was far enough away that walls absorbed the specifics, but the shape of it. The particular quality of two men's voices, when one of them is being told something he can't argue his way out of and knows it. It lasted about 12 minutes. Then a door, then silence. Kept washing the supper dishes. Danny came in 20 minutes later to return a bucket he'd borrowed, and his face had the look of someone who had heard more than he was going to admit to. "Everything all right out there?" Maeve asked. "Mr. Creed sent Silas to the bunkhouse," Danny said carefully. "Told him to stay there until morning." "That's all?" "That's all I heard." He set down the bucket. Didn't leave immediately, which meant there was something else. "Mrs. Hollister. Some of the boys are saying Pike went to the bank in Harlan Crossing this afternoon, before Mr. Creed got back, talking to the loan manager about Blackthorn's credit." She stopped washing. "Where'd you hear that?" "Gustavo Reyes's son was in town for feed. Saw Pike going into the Merchant's Trust with 2 other men. Came out after 20 minutes. Danny shifted. "I don't know what it means." Maeve did know what it meant, or close enough to it. Pike had seen her confrontation with Ransom coming before Ransom even got back to the ranch. He was moving first, trying to establish a version of events at the bank before Ransom could establish his own. A wealthy merchant with a 3-year relationship with a territory bank was not nothing. He could make noise. He could suggest instability. He could plant enough doubt about Blackthorn's management that the loan renewal which Ransom needed for the winter operations became complicated. She dried her hands. "Thank you, Danny," she said. "Go get some sleep." He went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she went and knocked on the door of Ransom's study. He was still at his desk. The papers she'd compiled spread out in front of him, alongside the ranch's own account books, which he'd pulled from the shelf. He had a pencil, and he'd been making notes in the margin of his own ledger in the cramped, efficient handwriting of a man who thought faster than he wrote. He looked up when she came in. "Pike went to the Merchant's Trust today," she said. "Before you got back." Ransom set down the pencil. His jaw did something small and tight. "How sure are you?" Gustavo Reyes's boy saw it. He had no reason to make it up. Ransom leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man running calculations, not financial ones, but the other kind. The ones you run when you're trying to figure out how much time you have and what it's worth. "He's getting ahead of it," Ransom said. "Yes. If he puts enough in the loan manager's ear before you can show them the supply records, then anything you bring to that bank later looks like a counter-story. He's not trying to prove anything. He's just trying to make your version seem like one of 2 competing narratives. And a bank doesn't have to decide between competing narratives in your favor," Ransom said slowly. "It just has to decide it's not worth the risk." "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what would you do?" She hadn't expected him to ask that directly. She'd expected to give him the information and then step back while he decided, because that was the arrangement they had. That was the structure of her position here, and she was careful about the structure of her position here. But he'd asked. "I'd go to the bank before Pike can go back," she said. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. Take the supply records and Blackthorn's financial improvement over the past 3 months and lay it out clean. Don't make it about Pike, yet make it about Blackthorn's health as an account. Let the numbers do what numbers do when someone's actually looking at them." Ransom looked at her for a moment. "And Pike?" "Pike is a separate problem. Bigger." She kept her voice even. "The Cattlemen's Association meets in 3 weeks. If Pike has been doing this to Blackthorn, he's been doing some version of it to other ranches too. Not necessarily the same scheme, but the same principle. He's too smart to have one arrangement with one ranch. The question is whether the other ranchers know yet, and if they don't, whether they'd believe it if someone showed them." Ransom picked up the pencil and set it down again. A small, restless motion. "You're talking about bringing this to the association meeting. I'm talking about not waiting for Pike to define the situation on his own terms. He's already moving. You have to move faster." He looked at the papers on his then at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since about 3 days after he came out to the ranch." Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but something more layered. like he was updating something. "Sit down, Mrs. Hollister." She sat. "Tell me how you'd structure it," he said. "Presentation to the association, if it came to that." So she told him. Ransom left for Harlan Crossing before sunrise the next morning, with Maeve's compiled records in a leather satchel and his own account books under his arm. She had stayed up until midnight, helping him organize the presentation, not coaching him. Exactly, because Ransom Creed did not need to be coached on how to talk to men he'd known for 20 years. But sequencing. The order in which information landed mattered as much as the information itself. That was something she has understood in her bones from years of managing people's expectations around a table. He came back in the late afternoon. She heard the horse in the yard and watched from the kitchen window, and she could read the result in his posture before he even got through the door. Not a victory, but not a defeat either. Something in between, which was where most things actually lived. He came into the kitchen. She poured coffee. He sat down. "The loan manager is named Elias Pruett," Ransom said. "He's been with the Merchants Trust for 11 years. Careful. That's not necessarily bad, no." He listened. He looked at the numbers. He asked good questions about the supply discrepancy. Ransom wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He's not going to cancel the loan, but he's also not going to make any decisions about the renewal until he understands the full picture of what Pike's involvement has been, meaning he's waiting to see what comes out, meaning he's a careful man who doesn't want to be caught on the wrong side of something. Ransom paused. "He told me, off the record, that Pike came in yesterday with 2 associates from the Cattlemen's Association, men named Garfield and Hatch. Both of them have been using Pike as a primary supplier for years." Maeve absorbed that. Garfield and Hatch. She didn't know them personally, but she knew the names large operations. Both of them, the kind of ranchers who sat on the association's governing board. "So Pike already has association backing," she said. "He has association presence. Whether they're backing him or whether he's using their presence to imply backing, that's a distinction that matters." Does. She thought for a moment. If Garfield and Hatch have been using Pike for years, they might be victims of the same scheme. Or they might be part of it. Or, she paused, they might simply have too much invested in their relationship with Pike to examine their own records honestly. All 3 of those situations are different problems. Yes. Ransom set down the coffee cup. He looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that comes from a long day of managing the gap between what you know is true and what you can prove to someone else's satisfaction. "The association meeting is in 19 days, he said. "Pike will be there. Garfield and Hatch will be there. Every major ranch operator in the territory will be there." He looked at her. "I need to walk in with something that can't be dismissed as a personal dispute between Blackthorn and a merchant." "I know. Can you get me that?" She thought about the 19 days, about what she had and what she still needed. "I need to talk to Gustavo Reyes directly. And one of the other farmers I've been buying from a man named Caleb Whitmore, west of the county line. Both of them have dealt with Pike's operation in one form or another. If Pike has been squeezing his supply chain as well as his customers, there'll be records of that too, and they'll know where to find them." Ransom nodded slowly. "I can arrange for you to get there. I can arrange it myself, a beat. I don't doubt that. But a horse is faster than a wagon, and I haven't had access to one." She met his eyes evenly. "That's something you can provide. It would help." He almost smiled. "I'll have one ready tomorrow morning." Gustavo Reyes was a compact, sun-darkened man in his 60s who had been farming the same 40 acres for 30 years and had the particular combination of patience and wariness that belongs to men who have spent a lifetime doing honest work in. Proximity to people who weren't always honest themselves. He met Maeve in his yard, looked at the Blackthorn-branded horse she'd arrived on, and offered her water without asking any questions first, which she took as a good sign. She explained who she was and why she was there without preamble, because Gustavo Reyes did not look like a man who had patience for preamble. He listened. He didn't say anything until she was done. "Pike," he said finally. "Not a question. Just the name, sitting there. You've had dealings with his operation, used to." Gustavo looked out at his fields. 3 years back, he came out here wanting to establish a purchase arrangement. He'd buy my produce at a set price and distribute it to his ranch accounts. Seemed straightforward. The price he was offering was decent, not generous, but decent. And then the price he paid me started going down, little by little, and the price he charged the ranches started going up. He looked back at her. I figured it out about a year in. Went to him direct and told him I wasn't going to take less than market rate for my goods. He said the market was what he said it was. What did you do? Went around him. Started dealing direct with anyone who'd take a meeting. He paused. That's when Mrs. Hollister came and introduced herself. Paid fair prices, paid on time. That was enough. Did you keep records of what Pike paid you? The amounts, the dates? Gustavo looked at her steadily. Why? Because Ransom Creed is going to stand up at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in 19 days and show them what Pike has been doing to Blackthorn's supply accounts. If he can also show what Pike was doing on the other side, squeezing the farmers who supplied him, while simultaneously overcharging the ranches he supplied, then the picture is complete. She held his gaze. A complete picture is a lot harder to dismiss than a partial one. Gustavo was quiet for a long moment. A crow landed on the fence post between them, and then reconsidered and flew off. My records aren't fancy, he said. Neither are mine. Fancy isn't what matters. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned toward the house. Come inside, he said. I'll find the ledger. Caleb Whitmore was a different kind of man, younger, more guarded, with a wife and 3 young children and the specific anxiety of someone who has built something that could still be taken from him if the wrong person decided to take it. He met Maeve at his gate and didn't invite her in immediately. I know who you are, he said. Heard you're the one who got Blackthorn's kitchen running right. Part of it, Maeve said. Heard some other things too. He was watching her face. About why you're really there. She looked back at him without flinching. If you've heard from Pike's side, you've heard that I'm a scheming widow who manipulated her way into a wealthy rancher's operation. If you've heard from the ranch hands' side, you've heard that I cook a decent meal and keep honest records. She tilted her head slightly. Which one sounds more like the kind of thing that needs to be said to shut someone up? Caleb Whitmore's mouth moved, almost a smile, almost. He opened the gate. He didn't have records as organized as Gustavo's, but he had something almost most useful. He had a memory for numbers that was close to photographic. And he had 3 years of grudges against Pike's operation that he'd never had anyone worth telling to. Once he started talking, he didn't stop for 40 minutes. By the time Maeve left the Whitmore farm, she had enough to build something that would hold. Silas was gone when she got back to the ranch. Not sent away gone in the way that told her it hadn't been a clean departure. His bunk was stripped, and his personal gear was gone. But there were items left behind: a good pair of work gloves, a book, a hat with his initials stamped inside the brim. People who plan to leave take everything. People who flee in a hurry take what they can grab. Danny confirmed it that evening. He left around noon. Webb told him to be out by sunset. He left around noon. Did he say anything? He told Vance that this wasn't done. Danny paused. Then he left. Maeve thought about that. A man like Silas, with 3 years of a profitable arrangement suddenly dismantled, with his position at the only major ranch in the territory gone, he wasn't going to absorb that and move on. He was going to do something with it, and the most likely something was that he was going to go to Pike and tell him everything he knew about Maeve's records and Ransom's plans before the association meeting, which meant the 19 days she'd calculated just got shorter. She went to find Ransom. He was in the barn, which was where she'd learned he went when he was thinking through something he didn't want other people's input on yet. She understood that. She'd felt the same way about the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She told him about Silas. He listened, his hand resting on the stall door, looking at the middle distance. Pike already knew most of it, he said. He's not going to learn anything new from Silas. He's going to learn the specific records I have and how I compiled them. He'll know to prepare a counter-argument. Can he counter them? He can try to discredit them. She leaned against the stall post. He'll say the records were compiled by a woman with no financial training and a personal grievance against both him and Silas. He'll say I had motive to falsify or selectively present information. He'll make it about me. She paused. Which is why we need Gustavo Reyes and Caleb Whitmore's records to stand alongside ours. Their interest in this is straightforward. They're farmers who got squeezed by the same operation. They don't have a personal connection to Blackthorn. That independence matters. Ransom turned to look at her fully. You've already talked to them this afternoon. They'll both come to the meeting if you extend the invitation. Whitmore will need traveling expenses covered. Gustavo can come on his own. A long pause. I hired you to cook, Ransom said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the observation of a man confronting the distance between a thing he expected and a thing he got. I know. You've been running a parallel investigation for 2 months. I've been keeping records. The investigation is what the records turned into. He looked at her for another moment. Is there anything else I don't know? She thought about it. Honestly, I think the water rights question is going to come up at the meeting. Pike will try to raise it if he needs to shift the ground. He has relationships with 2 of the association members who sit on the Water Commission, and if he can make this about Blackthorn's standing rather than his own conduct, the water rights become leverage. Ransom's expression darkened. Who told you about the water rights issue? Nobody told me. I read the association quarterly report that was in your study. The water allocation renewal is on the same meeting agenda as the general business session, where Pike's contract relationships are listed as a discussion item. She held up a hand before he could say anything. The door to your study was open. The report was on the desk. I read the cover page when I brought your supper in 2 weeks ago. Stared at her. You read that in one pass. I have a good memory for numbers and dates. She kept her voice neutral. I should have mentioned it sooner. That was a mistake. Ransom ran one hand back through his hair, a gesture she'd come to associate with him, recalibrating, with taking a version of events he'd been holding and exchanging it for a more accurate one. The water rights renewal is tied to a demonstration of operational stability. If Pike can make Blackthorn look unstable, the Commission could defer the renewal, which would affect your winter water access for the southern pastures. She met his eyes, which is why the case you make at the association meeting can't just be about the invoices. It has to be about Blackthorn's stability and improvement under current management, financially, operationally, the whole picture. Ransom was quiet for a long moment. The horses shifted in the low evening light. From somewhere outside she could hear 2 of the hands talking, their voices carrying but not their words. You're talking about putting yourself in that room, Ransom said. I'm talking about the records being in that room. Whether I'm there in person is a separate question. Pike will make it personal. I know, he'll go after your history. Thomas. Everything. She held his gaze without blinking. I know that too. And I'm not the one who should be afraid of having my record examined. She said it simply, without heat. Everything I've done at Blackthorn is documented. Every purchase, every cost, every supply arrangement. If someone wants to look at my record, let them look at it. A pause. Can the same be said of his? Ransom looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I want you at that meeting. The days between that conversation and the association meeting had a different texture than the weeks before them, not the low, grinding tension of working in secret with Silas watching, but something sharper and more directional, like the period before a storm when you can see it coming, and all you can do is make sure everything that matters is secured. Maeve finished her records. She compiled everything into a clean copy and a working copy, the way she always kept 2 of everything, and she put them in the leather document case that Ransom provided without comment. Corresponded with Gustavo Reyes twice by letter, confirming his records and the specific dates that mattered. Caleb Whitmore came by the ranch once, unannounced, to show her an additional invoice he'd found at the back of his files, a discrepancy he'd overlooked during her visit, a significant one, from 18 months prior. She added it to the working copy. She also kept cooking. That was the thing about the kitchen, it did not pause for larger events. 46 men needed 3 meals a day, regardless of what was happening with the territory's most powerful merchant, and the bread didn't rise faster because the stakes were high. There was something steadying about that, something that kept her from getting too far ahead of herself. Ransom ate in the kitchen twice that week, which was unusual. Both times he came in with the energy of a man who had been talking to other ranchers, she could tell, because he always came back from those conversations slightly more animated and slightly more frustrated simultaneously. The way you get when you're trying to move a conversation in a direction that people haven't quite gotten to yet. The second evening, he told her what he'd found. I've spoken to 4 other ranchers quietly, he said. Off the record, preliminary. 2 of them, Hartwell and Sorensen, are willing to compare their supply invoices against market rate once they've had a chance to look. He paused. The other 2 said they didn't see the need. Garfield and Hatch? Maeve guessed. Garfield and Hatch. They're the ones who went to the bank with Pike. Yes. He set down his coffee. I don't know yet whether they're in on the arrangement, or whether they've just decided their relationship with Pike is worth more to them than the truth about his pricing. He sounded like he genuinely didn't know and was bothered by not knowing. I've done business with Garfield for 11 years. People do unexpected things when their financial arrangements are examined, Maeve said. She said it without judgment, just as a fact. You won't know which one they are until they're in that room and have to choose. And if they choose Pike's version? She thought about it honestly. Then the farmer's records become more important. Because Gustavo and Whitmore don't have any reason to protect Pike's version. And their documentation shows what was happening on both sides of his operation. She met his eyes. If Garfield and Hatch have been overpaying Pike the same way Blackthorn was, and Gustavo's records show what Pike was actually paying for the goods, then the math is undeniable, regardless of who's standing in front of it. Ransom nodded slowly. The math is undeniable, he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. It's the one thing in that room that doesn't have a stake in its own outcome, Maeve said. People have agendas, numbers don't. The morning of the association meeting arrived with a particular flatness of October in Texas, the sky white and thin, the air with a bite in it that would build through the day, but hadn't decided to yet. Maeve was up at 3, same as always. She had bread going and coffee ready, and the first service done before the sky showed any color. When she came out of the kitchen to get into the wagon, she found Vance standing near the horse. Some of us want to come, he said. She stopped. What? To the meeting. Not inside, we know it's not our place to be inside, but outside. He was looking at the middle distance, the way he did when he was saying something that cost him something to say. There's been talk. Silas has been through 3 other ranches in the last week, telling his version of things. Saying you falsified records. Saying Mr. Creed has been, he stopped. Well, saying things. Maeve looked at him. His right hand was resting against his side, curved slightly inward the way it always was. Coming and standing outside a meeting doesn't change what happens inside it, she said. No, Vance agreed. But it changes what people see when they come out of it. He finally looked at her directly. 8 of us want to come. We've worked this ranch a combined 40-some years. If someone wants to make this about whether you deserve to be here, we'd like to be visible. She didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about what it cost a man like Vance to say something like that. With his hand the way it was, and his need for his position secure, and 2 boys in Abilene waiting on his pay. That's your choice to make, she said finally. Yes, ma'am, he said. It is. She got into the wagon. Ransom was already up on the seat. They drove toward Harlan Crossing in the thin early light, and when she looked back once from the road, she could see 8 horses following at a respectful distance behind. She turned back around. She opened the document case across her knees and checked her papers one more time, even though she knew every number on every page. It was not a practical exercise. It was the thing her hands needed to do while the rest of her composed itself for what was ahead. The Harlan Crossing Cattlemen's Association Hall was a long wooden building at the north end of the main street, with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a carved lintel that said Established 1873. There were already 6 wagons and a dozen horses in front when they arrived. Ransom helped her down without theatrics, and they walked in together. Orson Pike was already inside. He was standing near the front of the room, with Garfield and Hatch on either side, and 3 other men she didn't know behind him, and he was the first person in the room who saw her come in. Something moved across his face: surprise, recalculation, then the practiced, reasonable expression reasserting itself like a mask being pressed back into place. He had not expected her to be here. That was the first advantage she had, and she filed it away and kept her face neutral and found a chair to the side of the room where she could see everyone and everything without being at the center of anything. Not yet. The meeting came to order at 9. The association chairman, a man named Aldridge, whom she'd heard Ransom describe as fair-minded but cautious, opened with the standard agenda items. Water Commission report, seasonal range updates, financial reports from association operations. She watched Garfield and Hatch. Both were in their 50s, both heavy-set, both with the particular settled authority of men who had occupied the same position for long enough that they'd stopped noticing they occupied it. Garfield was watching Ransom. Hatch was watching her. The supply contract discussion came at the end of the formal agenda, which was where Pike had presumably had it placed end of meeting. When people were tired, when the path of least resistance was to nod through what the experienced men said and go home for midday dinner. Aldridge introduced it as a routine discussion of territory-wide supplier relationships. Pike stood before Ransom could. He was good. Maeve acknowledged that to herself without pleasure. He was practiced and smooth, and he deployed reasonableness like a tool. Citing Blackthorn's long relationship with his operation, acknowledging the recent changes under new kitchen management, expressing with a just perceptible emphasis his concern about the reliability of cost analysis performed by someone without formal financial training. Then he looked at Maeve. I understand Ms. Hollister has compiled certain records during her brief time at Blackthorn, he said. I want to assure this association that I welcome any review of legitimate documentation. But I would ask this body to consider whether accusations assembled by a woman recently arrived under complex circumstances should be the basis for questioning the commercial relationships that have served this territory for years. Complex circumstances, there it was. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. Knowing it was coming did not mean it landed without weight. She felt it in her chest, the way you feel a door slammed near you, the physical shock of it, regardless of whether you saw it coming. She did not move. She did not change her expression. Ransom stood up. And instead of defending her, instead of making it about her at all, he walked to the front of the room and set Maeve's ledger on the table in front of Aldridge. Blackthorn's food expenses dropped by $18 per month in the first month under Mrs. Hollister's management, he said. In the following month, $22. In the third month, $19. Over 90 days, that's a reduction of nearly $60 against a consistent supply volume. He paused. I'd like those numbers reviewed by anyone in this room who wants to check them. He opened the ledger to the supply comparison pages. Then he set Gustavo Reyes's records alongside them. Then Caleb Whitmore's. These records come from two independent farmers who supplied Pike's operation at below market rates, while Pike charged above market rates to his ranch accounts, Ransom said. His voice had the quality of a man stating something he has looked at carefully and is now simply describing. The gap between what he paid his suppliers and what he charged his customers is not a market fluctuation. It is a consistent pattern across 3 years and multiple product categories. The room was very quiet. Aldridge picked up Gustavo's ledger. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, and this was the moment, Maeve had been building toward, without knowing quite how it would come, Hartwell, from the far side of the room, said quietly, "Can I see those?" Ransom looked up. Of course. Hartwell came forward and took the papers. He stood there reading them, with the focused stillness of a man who has just recognized something, and Maeve watched his face and knew before he said a word that he was comparing what he was reading against numbers he already knew from his own operation. What was the salt pork price in the February invoices? Hartwell said, to no one in particular. 14 cents per pound, Maeve said. Everyone looked at her. She held the room's attention without flinching. The market rate in February was 11 cents. It had been 11 cents for 3 months prior. That's in the county trade registry, which is a public document. She looked at Hartwell specifically. If your February invoice from Pike shows 14 cents, that's a 27% markup against the documented market rate for that period. Hartwell looked at his partner, Sorensen. Sorensen looked at Hartwell. Something passed between them. I'd like to see the full comparison records, Sorensen said. Garfield stood up. His face was doing something complicated, not quite anger, not quite alarm, the expression of a man trying to figure out which way the floor is tilting before he decides where to stand. This is a significant accusation to be making, based on a cook's kitchen records, he said. No disrespect intended. Then look at the farmer's records, Maeve said, before Ransom could answer. She was aware of herself standing up as she said it, not as a dramatic gesture, but simply because the room required it. Mr. Reyes and Mr. Whitmore are not Blackthorn employees. They have no stake in this outcome beyond being paid honestly for their work, which they have not been. She kept her voice even and clear. If Blackthorn's records concern you, set them aside. The farmer's records stand on their own. If Pike's pricing practices are visible in an independent supplier's ledger, that's not a cook's interpretation. That's arithmetic. Pike was on his feet. This woman, he said, and his voice had lost the practiced reasonableness now, gone somewhere harder and more exposed, has been at Blackthorn Ranch for 3 months. She arrived with a ruined reputation, under circumstances surrounding her husband's death that were never fully resolved. And she has spent her time there not cooking, but running a personal campaign against commercial relationships that were functioning appropriately before she arrived. The room was very still. Maeve looked at Pike directly. "My husband died of liver failure after 14 months of excessive drinking," she said. "County inquest returned a finding of natural causes. The record is public. Anyone in this room can read it." A pause. "My reputation was ruined by people who found it useful to ruin it. That is a different thing from it deserving to be ruined." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. If what I've done at Blackthorn Ranch is a personal campaign, it's the kind of personal campaign that saved that ranch $60 in 3 months, and is about to save every ranch in this territory from continuing to overpay the same merchant. She let a beat of silence sit there. "Look at the numbers, gentlemen. Not at me. The numbers don't care about my reputation." Pike's mouth opened. Aldridge held up his hand. "Sit down, Orson," he said, and the quality of the room changed. Pike sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when he's been told to by someone with the authority to tell him, and his face did the thing faces do when the mask has slipped too far, to pull back up quickly a moment of raw exposure, something between fury and calculation, before the practiced reasonableness reasserted itself in a diminished form. Not convincing anymore. Just present. Aldridge picked up Gustavo Reyes's ledger. He was a deliberate man. Aldridge the kind who read things fully before he responded to them, which Maeve had been counting on without knowing him personally, just from what Ransom had said and from the way he'd run the first hour of the meeting. He read for 3 full minutes while the room held its particular charged silence, the kind that happens when everyone present is trying to figure out which way the outcome is going to fall. Then he passed the ledger to the man on his left, who passed it to the man on his left, and it went around the table that way, hand to hand, each man reading with the specific focus of someone recognizing something familiar. Hartwell was the first to speak. "My February invoice from Pike shows 14 cents per pound for salt pork," he said. He said it without drama. Just a statement of fact, the way men state facts, when the facts are bad enough that dramatizing them would feel inadequate. He looked at Sorensen. "Does yours?" Sorensen had already pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. He unfolded it, looked at it. 13.5 cents. Maeve watched the room. Not Pike, she already knew what Pike's face was doing. She watched the men on the edges, the ones who hadn't spoken yet, the ones who were doing arithmetic in their heads. She could see it happening. The moment when the comparison moves from being someone else's story to being your own. Garfield said nothing. He had his arms crossed, and he was looking at the floor, and he had the appearance of a man who has been presented with information that requires him to make a decision he doesn't want to make. Hatch beside him shifted in his chair. Aldridge set down the last of the papers. He looked at Pike. "Orson, I'm going to ask you to respond to the supply price comparison directly, not to Mrs. Hollister's qualifications or her history, to the numbers." Pike had composed himself. The practiced reasonableness was back, but it was running on a weaker engine than it had been an hour ago. Market prices in the territory fluctuate based on transportation costs, seasonal availability, and the operational costs of maintaining reliable supply chains, he said. A merchant who guarantees consistent delivery absorbs risk that a direct farm arrangement cannot account for. "What risk?" Ransom said. He was still standing near the front of the room, and his voice had the quality of someone asking a question they already know the answer to. "Gustavo Reyes has delivered to Blackthorn every week for 3 months, without a single missed delivery or quality issue. No intermediary, no markup. What risk specifically is worth a 27% premium?" Pike opened his mouth. "Don't," Aldridge said quietly. And Orson Pike, for the first time in the conversation, did not have an answer that was going to help him. The meeting recessed at 11:30. Aldridge called it 30 minutes, he said, so men could get water and take the air and, though he didn't say this part, so the room could decompress enough to have a rational second session. Maeve walked outside with Ransom, and they stood on the porch in the October light, and neither of them said anything immediately. The 8 ranch hands from Blackthorn were across the street, standing near the horses with the studied casualness of men, pretending they weren't watching the building they'd ridden 12 miles to stand outside of. Vance saw her and gave a single nod. She nodded back. "Garfield hasn't said anything," Ransom said quietly. "He's making a decision. Which way? I don't know. She looked out at the street. He's been doing business with Pike for longer than you have. That's not just a financial relationship, that's identity. Admitting Pike has been cheating him means admitting he didn't notice it for years. Men like Garfield don't find that easy. Men like Garfield don't find it easy to admit anything. No. She paused. But if Hatch moves, Garfield will follow. They've operated as a unit for 20 years. If Hatch decides the math matters more than the relationship, Garfield won't want to be the only man in that room defending Pike. Ransom leaned against the porch post. What makes you think Hatch is movable? The way he's been looking at his hands for the past hour. She glanced at him sideways. Men who've made up their minds look at people. Men who are making up their minds look at their hands. Ransom was quiet for a moment. Then, without turning toward her, where did you learn to read rooms like that? She thought about it. Honestly. Survival, she said. You learn to read a room when leaving the wrong impression has consequences. He was quiet again, and it was a different kind of quiet than his usual. Quiet, not the absence of something to say, but the presence of something he was deciding whether to say. He didn't say it. Not then. The water rights, he said instead. Aldridge will take that up in the second session. Yes. Pike will try to raise the operational stability question. Let him. Ransom straightened up. I'll have the production numbers ready. The herd weight and grade averages from the drive are as strong as anything Blackthorn has put out in 5 years. That's operational stability. And I'll have the food cost reduction figures. He looked at her for a moment. A stable kitchen is evidence of a stable ranch. It's not the metaphor they usually use, she said. But the numbers say the same thing, regardless of how you frame them. He almost smiled. Let's go back in. The second session had a different temperature than the first. Some of it was the recess, the 30 minutes in which men had spoken to each other in small groups, compared notes, done their own arithmetic. Some of it was the ledgers, which had continued to circulate during the break, and which several men had photographed in their memories, or copied numbers from onto whatever paper was available. The documentary evidence had been doing its work without anyone having to argue for it. Hatch spoke first, surprised Maeve, and, she could see, surprised Garfield too. Stood up with a particular deliberateness, the deliberateness of someone who has made an uncomfortable decision and is going to execute it before he can change his mind. And he said that he had reviewed his own supply invoices against the comparison figures in the Reyes ledger, and that the discrepancy on his accounts over the past 2 years was, by his estimate, in the range of $300. The room went very quiet in a new way. $300. Garfield's face had gone the specific gray of a man absorbing something he's been trying not to absorb. Hatch sat down. He didn't look at Pike. Aldridge wrote something down. He looked up at Pike. Do you want to respond to Mr. Hatch's figure? Pike said. These are rough estimates based on an incomplete understanding of market dynamics over a 2-year period. Then let's make it precise, Hartwell said. Bring us your full supply ledgers, Orson. For every ranch account you've operated in this territory over the past 3 years. If the numbers are as explainable as you say, explaining them should be straightforward. The silence that followed had the weight of a door closing. Because everyone in the room understood. Everyone had understood for the past hour, if they were honest with themselves, that Orson Pike was not going to produce those ledgers. Not voluntarily. Not in that room, not in any room. The request wasn't a genuine question. It was the shape of a verdict being rendered in real time. Pike looked at Aldridge. This is not a formal proceeding. This association has no authority to compel commercial records. Correct, Aldridge said. We have no authority to compel them. He paused. We have authority to recommend to our member ranches that they review their own accounts against market rate records and pursue appropriate remedies through the county court if they identify grounds. He looked around the table. I'd like to move that recommendation. It passed. 7 votes for, 2 abstentions. Garfield abstained, not voted against. Maeve noted that. It was not a clean outcome, but it was not nothing either. Pike stood up one more time. His face had the quality of marble, now cold and set, and refusing to show anything that could be used against him. This association has been manipulated by a newcomer with a grievance and a rancher who hired her. I want that on the record. Noted, Aldridge said. Anything else? A beat. The water rights, Pike said. Blackthorn's renewal should be tabled, pending a full review of operational management changes. The gambit. She'd been waiting for it. Ransom was already on his feet. Blackthorn's southern herd came in at 412 head, average grade premium, highest yield per head. This operation has produced in 6 years. He set the drive records on the table in front of Aldridge. Food costs down $60 in 3 months. 3 months in which the kitchen has not missed a single service, not a single supply failure, not a single complaint from the hands about the quality or quantity of their meals. He paused. If that is not a demonstration of operational stability, I'd like to hear what definition is being used. The Water Commission representatives, 2 men named Birch and Colson, who sat at the far end of the table, looked at each other. Birch picked up the drive records, read them, set them down. The renewal stands, Birch said. Conditional on nothing that's been raised today. Pike sat down for the last time. Outside, in the thin October light, Maeve stood on the porch steps while the meeting broke apart around her men coming out in 2s and 3s. The low, concentrated conversation of people processing, something that had changed the shape of what they understood. Ransom was still inside with Aldridge and 2 of the other ranchers, doing the practical follow-through that victory in a room like that still required. Gustavo Reyes appeared beside her. He had arrived midway through the second session, quietly, and had sat in the back without speaking. And his presence had been its own form of testimony, a man who had come 40 miles to be visible in a room where his name was being used as evidence. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Tired," she said. "Good tired or bad tired? Ask me tomorrow." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You did well in there. The numbers did well. I just kept them organized." Gustavo looked at her sideways. "If that's what you want to say." He put on his hat. "I'll have my full ledger sent to the county court office by end of week. Whitmore too," he told me. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for finding a reason to." He nodded once and walked toward his horse. Vance came across the street with the other 7 ranch hands trailing behind him, and he had the expression of a man who had been reading the body language of people coming out of the building for the past 3 hours, and had formed a reasonable assessment. "Well," he said, "the association is recommending member ranches review their supply accounts," Maeve said. "The water rights renewal stands." Pike's position in the room was, she thought about how to put it, substantially reduced. Vance looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to the other men and gave a single short nod that contained the entire summary of the situation, and the other 7 received it with the quiet satisfaction of men who had ridden 12 miles on a cold morning for exactly this and gotten it. Danny Pruitt was grinning. He was 17, and he hadn't learned yet how to contain that kind of thing when it happened. Maeve thought about telling him to school his face. She decided not to. Let him grin. Silas came back to Blackthorn 3 days later. Not to stay, he came with a wagon and 2 other men she didn't know, men who had the particular look of people doing work they're not invested in for a flat fee, and they went to the bunkhouse to collect the things he'd left behind when he'd fled in a hurry. Maeve watched from the kitchen window and said nothing. It was Ransom who went out to meet him in the yard. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood, but she could see it. Silas was doing most of the talking, which surprised her. She'd expected Ransom to set the terms of whatever was being said. But Silas was talking with the energy of someone making a case, hands moving, face working through something. Ransom listened. His own face was the contained version, the one that gave nothing away. Then Ransom said something short, 2 sentences at most. Silas stopped talking. He looked at Ransom for a moment. Then he turned and went back to the wagon and said something to the 2 men, and they finished loading and drove back out the gate. Ransom came into the kitchen. "What did he say?" Maeve asked. Ransom poured himself coffee with the unhurried motion of a man who has decided how he feels about something and doesn't need to perform that feeling. He said he wants it on record that he was acting on Pike's instructions from the beginning, that he didn't design the scheme, that Pike approached him in his first year at Blackthorn with a proposal, and he took it because the money was good, and he needed the money. He sat down. He said Pike told him it was standard practice across most of the territory's supply operations. "Do you believe him?" Ransom considered. "About the origin, partly. Pike is smart enough not to approach a man cold. He'd have established the relationship first, made it seem like it was just how things worked. Whether Silas needed much convincing is a different question. He picked up the cup. He wanted me to tell the county court he cooperated. Will you? I'll tell them he came and told me his version of events." He set down the cup. "I won't tell them he cooperated, because he didn't cooperate. He ran and then he came back when he figured out which way the tide was going. He looked at her. There's a difference. Yes, she said. There is. She went back to the bread she'd been working, and she thought about Silas without much heat, without the anger she might have expected to feel. Or maybe the anger had been spent over the weeks of working beside his suspicion and his deliberate cruelty, and what was left was something flatter and more durable. He had been afraid and greedy, and he had made choices that came from both of those things, and now he was going to live with them. That was its own kind of conclusion. Pike's lawyers have been to the county court office, Ransom said, after a moment. He's preparing a response to the formal complaint Hartwell and Sorensen filed this week. That'll take months. Yes, long enough that he's hoping people will lose interest or decide it's not worth the fight. He paused. He doesn't know Hartwell. Hartwell's the type who finishes things. He is. Ransom looked at the table surface. He told me yesterday he'd found 7 years of supply invoices in his records. The discrepancy on his account alone is over $500. The number sat there for a moment. Pike's been doing this for a long time, Maeve said. A long time. To a lot of people. She folded the bread dough, turned it, pressed it flat. Then it needed doing a long time ago. Ransom was quiet. Then, the bank confirmed the loan renewal this morning. Full amount, standard terms. Pruett sent a letter. She didn't stop working. Good. And the association's recommendation went out to all member ranches by messenger yesterday. Aldridge wrote it himself. He paused. Your name is in it. She looked up. He cited the supply records specifically. Described them as thorough and independently corroborated. A pause. He used the word meticulous. She went back to the bread. She didn't say anything because she wasn't sure what to say, and she didn't believe in filling silence with words that weren't needed. Maeve, Ransom said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Her given name. Not Mrs. Hollister, just the name itself. The way people use a name when the formality has finally become too much of a performance. She looked up again. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the reading expression, the quick assessment she'd gotten used to, but something slower and more unguarded, the kind of expression that belongs to a moment a person wasn't entirely planning. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically. I usually answer things honestly, she said. I know. That's why I'm asking. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. When you're done here, when this is settled, what do you want? Not what you need, not what's practical. What do you actually want? She looked at him. The question had weight, more weight than it appeared to have on the surface. And she was aware of that, and she was also aware of herself being careful around the edges of it. The way you're careful around something that matters more than you fully admitted. I want to build something that lasts, she said. Not just manage someone else's something. My own, she paused. And I want my mother to be comfortable. And I want to, she stopped. What? She hadn't intended to say the last part. But Ransom Creed had a specific quality when he asked questions, a quality of genuine attention that made dishonesty feel like more effort than honesty, and the question had already come out of her mouth before she'd finished deciding whether to say it. I want to not have to prove myself every time I walk into a room, she said. I'm tired of it. I know I'm capable. I've known for years. I'm tired of the first thing being the convincing. Ransom was quiet for a moment. You won't have to here, he said. Not anymore. Not after what happened in that room. People's memories are short. Not for this. Not in this territory. He set down the cup. What I'm trying to say, and I'm doing it badly, is that what you've done here is permanent. You can't unlearn it, and nobody who was in that room can pretend they didn't see it. He paused. Your position at Blackthorn is permanent. Whatever you want to do with it. She looked at him steadily. That's very generous, Mr. Creed, Ransom. A beat. That's very generous, Ransom, she said. He nodded. He picked up his cup. He went out. She stood at the kitchen table, with the bread dough warm under her hands, and she thought about the conversation for a moment. Just a moment, before she set it aside and went back to work. Because there was a rhythm to the kitchen that didn't pause for the things that happened outside it, and she had always found comfort in that rhythm. Always found that the act of making food for people who needed it was a good place to think through things that were too large to look at directly. She worked. She let herself think. The change in the ranch came gradually. The way the change always came, not a sudden transformation, but an accumulation of small adjustments that you only noticed in retrospect. The men stopped calling her Mrs. Hollister with any irony in it. It had been their name for her from early on, but for the first months, there had been a slight hesitation in it, an inflection that carried the ghost of the laughter from that first morning. The hesitation disappeared sometime around the 4th week after the association meeting, and Maeve noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd gotten so accustomed to. You'd stopped registering it as a sound. Hector Garza started taking his full portion without her having to arrange it as leftover. He just took it, the way a man takes what he's earned. And one morning he said to her quietly, while he was waiting on his second cup of coffee, "My daughter in San Antonio does needlework, sends it out for sale. She's trying to save enough to get herself out of a situation." Maeve looked at him. What kind of situation? The kind a woman gets into when she married someone who looked better before the wedding than after. He wrapped both hands around the cup. She's got 2 children, and she's proud, and she won't ask for help. How much does she need? Hector shook his head. "I'm not asking for money, Mrs. Hollister. I'm just telling you." He looked at his coffee. Sometimes it helps to tell someone who'd understand it. She thought about that for a moment. Would she consider work? Real work, I mean. Not the needlework, something that paid a wage. She'd consider anything that didn't feel like charity. "Then give me her address," Maeve said. "I want to write to her." Hector looked at her for a moment, with the face of a man who had been holding something heavy for a long time and was being offered a place to set it down. He didn't cry. He wasn't the type. But something in the lines around his eyes changed. "I'll write it down tonight," he said. That evening, Maeve sat at the kitchen table after the washing up was done, and she wrote a letter to Hector's daughter in San Antonio, and she also wrote a letter to Clara Briggs in Claraville, the widow with 3 children that she'd sent the $5 2 weeks ago through Webb. The letters were practical. They asked specific questions about skills, availability, needs. They were not charity letters. They were the kind of letters you write when you're gathering information for a plan that is still forming but has already decided to happen. She wrote a 3rd letter that night to herself, in her head, while she was banking the stove for the morning. It was not a letter she'd ever put on paper. It was more a reckoning, the kind you do when things have changed enough that the person you were at the beginning of something needs to be updated about who you are at the middle of it. She had arrived at Blackthorn with nowhere to go, and a 30-day window, and a cast-iron skillet, and her mother in a wagon seat with a bad hip. She had been laughed at in this yard. She had been mocked for her size and her history, and the fact of her widowhood, and the specific kind of woman she was too large, too poor, too unfortunate, too complicated, too much of things that made other people uncomfortable, and not enough of things they preferred. And she had decided, somewhere in the first week, that she was not going to spend any of the energy that decision required on being angry about it, because anger was expensive, and she was working with limited resources, and the kitchen didn't heat itself. She had worked. She had kept records. She had paid attention to the men who were easy to overlook, the ones with the bad hands and the failing strength and the private shames, because she knew what it felt like to be overlooked, and she had not liked it, and she was not going to be the kind of person who forgot that feeling once she had a little ground under her feet. And somewhere in there, the math of the situation had shifted. Not because anyone had decided to let it shift. Because the work was visible, and visible work is very hard to deny indefinitely. And eventually the people who had been denying it ran out of ground to stand on. That was not a romance. That was not a miracle. That was just what happened when a person kept showing up and doing the actual thing, and didn't disappear when they were supposed to. She banked the stove. She went to bed. Ransom came into the kitchen the following evening, Thursday, which had become a pattern without either of them naming it as one, and he sat in the same chair in the middle of the table, not the head, and he had his coffee and the usual quiet that preceded whatever he'd actually come to say. He said, "There's a piece of land on the eastern edge of Blackthorn property, about 12 acres. It's been unused since my father's time. The house that was on it needs work, but the structure is sound." Maeve looked at him from the other side of the table. She was mending one of the kitchen linens, because mending was the kind of task her hands could do, while the rest of her paid attention to something else. "What about it?" she said. "I've been thinking about what you said, about building something of your own." He turned the cup in his hands. 12 acres, a sound structure, access to the east water line. It's not doing anything. It could be doing something. Kept her hands moving on the linen. What kind of something? Whatever kind you want. He paused. There are women in this territory in the position you were in 8 months ago. You know what that position feels like. You know what would have helped and what wouldn't. He looked at her. I have land I'm not using. You have a plan that's already forming. You wrote letters last night. Hector mentioned it. She set down the mending. Hector mentioned it. He didn't mean to. He was telling me about his daughter. He mentioned the letter as part of it. A pause. Was that wrong of me to bring up? She considered. No. So what's the plan? She had not articulated the plan fully yet, even to herself. But it had been assembling itself in the back of her mind for weeks, the way plans do when you're paying attention to the right things. Women who are trying to rebuild, she said. Not charity cases, I won't run charity. It takes away the wrong things from people. But women who have skills and need time and a place to use them. Work that pays, that builds something for them while they're there. Housing while they get stable. She paused. Something that treats them like adults who've had bad circumstances, not like problems to be managed. Ransom was quiet for a long moment. That's specific, he said. I've been thinking about it for a while. I know. He looked at the table. I'd want to be involved. Not to run it, that's yours, but to support it, financially, and with the ranch's infrastructure where it makes sense. He looked up at her. That would require a more permanent arrangement than a cook's wage. She looked at him steadily. She understood what he was reaching toward, and she understood it imperfectly. And she was not going to pretend she understood it more clearly than she did, because pretending was not something she had patience for. What kind of arrangement, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Maeve, he said. And again it was just her name, just the word itself, with all the formality stripped out of it. I'm going to say something, and I want you to let me finish it before you correct me. I'll try. When you walked into this yard 8 months ago, I hired you because I needed a cook, and I thought you might be good at it. And I didn't see any reason not to give you the 30 days. He paused. That was true. That was also about a quarter of the reason. The other 3/4 was that you walked into this yard with your mother in a wagon and a skillet in your bag and 6 cowboys laughing at you, and you looked at Silas Vane with those green eyes, and you did not even blink. He stopped. I'd never seen that. Not from anyone. She kept her eyes on his. I'm not confused about what I feel, he said. I'm not grateful in calling it something else. I know what gratitude feels like. I felt it when the herd came in strong. I felt it when the water rights came through. This is not that. He let that sit for a moment. I know you have reasons to be skeptical of what men say they feel. I know your history. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to let me show you, over time, with enough consistency that you can form your own conclusion. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the yard, one of the horses shifted, and a piece of fence rattled lightly in the evening wind. Maeve looked at Ransom Creed at the weathered face, and the direct eyes and the hands around the coffee cup that were not entirely steady, which was the detail she noticed, the detail that mattered most, because unsteady hands in a steady man meant something real was happening. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I want you to let me finish it before you respond. All right. I have spent the majority of my adult life being looked at in a specific way, like I was too much of the wrong things, like I was someone to be managed or dismissed or moved past. She kept her voice even. And the most dangerous thing that could happen to me is mistaking a man's gratitude for something that runs deeper. Because I've been there too with Thomas, and I know what that particular mistake costs. She paused. So I'm careful, not cold careful. There's a difference. I understand that. And the other thing is she stopped, started again. I'm not the woman I was when I came here. I wasn't expecting to be different. I was expecting to survive. But somewhere in the last 8 months, I stopped just surviving. She looked at him. And I'm not willing to give any part of that away for sentiment. Not even good sentiment. I'm not asking you to, Ransom said. I'm asking if you'd consider sharing it. Silence. She picked up the mending, set it down again. Ask me again in the spring, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the deliberateness of a man who understands that some answers that are not yet yes are also not no, and knows the difference. In the spring, he said. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He paused at the door. The 12 acres. Regardless of anything else. They're yours to use if you want them. No conditions. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. and meant it with all the weight the words could carry. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table for a long moment in the quiet of the evening, with the stove ticking as it cooled and the lamp throwing its small circle of light across the table, and she thought about the shape of what was happening. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel afraid of what the shape of things was becoming. She picked up the mending. She worked until the lamp needed oil, and then she filled it and kept working, because there was always more to do, and she had never minded that. Spring came to Blackthorn the way it always came to that part of Texas, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 cold days, followed by rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be serious about itself. The creek at the eastern edge of the property ran high through March, and then settled into something manageable by April. And the vegetable garden that Maeve had been working since her first weeks at the ranch came up with the particular insistence of things that have been properly tended. She was in that garden on the morning Ransom asked her again. She had known it was coming, not because he'd signaled it, but because she'd been paying attention to him for 8 months. And she understood by now the specific quality of quiet that preceded something he'd been holding for a while. Came out to the garden with 2 cups of coffee, which was itself the signal, because Ransom did not ordinarily bring coffee to the garden. He handed her one. She straightened up from the row of early beans and took it. "It's spring," he said. "It is," she said. They stood there for a moment in the early morning light, the garden between them and the eastern land, visible beyond the fence line, the 12 acres he'd given her use of, where construction had been underway for 6 weeks. She could see the roof of the house from where they stood. The men from Harlan Crossing had fixed the structure sound before February was out, and what had been done since then was her work, the planning of it, the layout of the rooms, the decisions about what the place needed to be. "You've been watching that house go up every morning," Ransom said. "It's almost ready, I know." He turned the cup in his hands. The unsteady hands tell. She'd been watching for it. "Maeve." She looked at him. "I said I'd ask you again in the spring," he said. "So I'm asking. Not the land, not the arrangement, I mean all of it. I mean the actual question." She looked at him for a long moment. The weathered face, the direct eyes. The man who had hired her when 6 cowboys were laughing at her and had never once, in 8 months, looked at her like she was too much of the wrong things. "You understand what you'd be taking on," she said. "I come with a mother with a bad hip and a cast-iron skillet and opinions about supply ledgers. I know what I'd be taking on, and I'm not going to become less than what I am because it's more convenient. I won't do that again. I'm not asking you to." She looked at the house on the eastern acres, the garden, at the cup in her hands. "Yes," she said, not dramatically, not with tears or elaborate declaration. Just the word itself, clean and complete, the way she said most things that mattered. Ransom exhaled. It was a small sound, and she almost missed it, but she didn't miss it, and it told her more than anything he could have said about how long he'd been holding his breath on this particular question. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They drank their coffee in the garden, in the spring morning light, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while, which was its own kind of answer to a question that hadn't been asked out loud. They married in June, on a Tuesday, because Maeve had never seen any reason why a marriage needed to happen on a Saturday specifically, and a Tuesday meant the ranch work didn't need to stop for it. The ceremony was held in the main yard at Blackthorn, conducted by the county justice of the peace, a small man named Farquhar, who had married a significant portion of the territory and had developed an efficient, unfussy approach to the proceedings that Maeve appreciated. The ranch hands attended in their work clothes because she'd told them specifically not to dress up, and they stood in a loose group near the fence, with the collective expression of men who were not accustomed to emotion but were having it anyway and were making their peace with that fact. Danny Pruitt cried and pretended he had something in his eye. Vance stood beside him, with his right hand curved slightly inward, and his face set in the careful blankness of a man who is feeling something he considers private. Hector Garza stood at the back. His daughter from San Antonio was there too, Elena, 26, with 2 small children who had been running around the yard since morning and had worn themselves out enough by noon to be manageable. Elena had arrived at Blackthorn 2 months prior, at Maeve's invitation, and she was working in the new house on the eastern acres, as what Maeve called a house manager, which was a title that covered a range of practical responsibilities and paid a wage she could actually live on. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quality of paying attention to things, without advertising that she was doing it. She stood beside her father during the ceremony, and she didn't cry. But when it was over, she came to Maeve directly, before anyone else, and said, "Thank you for writing that letter." "You did the hard part," Maeve said. "You made it possible for the hard part to happen," Elena said. She said it simply, without performance. Then she went to chase her children, who had found the water trough. Lenora watched the whole thing from a chair that had been placed for her at the edge of the yard, because her hip would not hold her through a long standing, and Maeve could see from 30 feet away that her mother was doing the particular thing she did when she was moved to deliberate stillness. A focused composure that was almost identical to her everyday composure, except that her hands were folded more tightly than usual. After Farquhar had said the words, and Ransom had said yes, and Maeve had said yes, and it was done, Maeve went directly to her mother before she did anything else. Lenora looked up at her. "Well," Lenora said, "well," Maeve said. They looked at each other for a moment, and in that moment was everything the bad winter in Harlan Crossing, the wagon seat with the bad hip, the 40 miles of road, the laughter in the Blackthorn yard, the lamp burning low over the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. All of it compressed into a beat of silence between two women who had been through enough together that language was sometimes the less efficient tool. Then Lenora reached up and took Maeve's hand and held it, and Maeve let her, and that was enough. The house on the Eastern Acres opened in July. They called it Hollister House, which had been Ransom's suggestion and which Maeve had accepted after thinking it over, because the name meant something specific, not Blackthorn, not Creed, but Hollister, which was the name she'd carried through the worst of it, and which she wasn't interested in putting away just because things had gotten better. First women arrived in August. There were 4 of them, from different situations: a widow from the South County with a 12-year-old son, a woman who had left a difficult marriage with her 2 daughters, and nothing else, a younger woman who had been working in a Harlan Crossing laundry and couldn't make the numbers work, no matter how many hours she put in, and Clara Briggs, from Claraville, who had been the widow with 3 children that Maeve had sent the $5 to months ago through Webb. Clara arrived last, on a wagon driven by her eldest son, who was 11 and had the careful, responsible face of a child who had been the man of the family for too long. She climbed down and looked at the house and at the garden that had already been established and at Maeve standing in the yard, and she said, "I didn't think a place like this would actually exist." "It's not finished," Maeve said. "It'll keep being built." "That's all right." Clara looked at the house again. "So will we." The 4 women were not easy to manage, because women in difficult circumstances are not easy to manage, and anyone who builds something like Hollister House, expecting gratitude and compliance from people who have just survived something hard, is going to be disappointed quickly. Clara had opinions. The widow from South County was brittle in the specific way of people who have not yet processed what happened to them. The younger woman from the laundry was defensive about accepting help because she'd spent years being told that accepting help meant you'd failed. Maeve did not require them to be grateful. She did not require them to be easy. She required them to work and to treat the other women and children in the house with basic decency, and on those 2 requirements she did not negotiate. Everything else was something they'd figure out as they went. Elena Gerza ran the house's daily operations with the same quality of attention she'd inherited from her father: quiet, observant, consistently present. She and Maeve had developed a working relationship that was less employer and employee, and more the relationship of 2 people who have recognized in each other a similar way of approaching problems, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. Ransom visited Hollister House twice a week, always with a purpose: a repair that needed doing, a supply question, something practical, and Maeve noticed that he was careful about it. Careful not to make the house feel like an extension of Blackthorn's authority. It was a distinction he seemed to understand without being told, which she respected. One evening in September, they were sitting on the porch of the main house at Blackthorn after supper, a habit they'd developed. The one time of day when both of them were done with the specific demands of their work and could be still for a bit, and Ransom said, "Hartwell came by today." "About Pike?" "The county court proceedings are moving. Slowly, but moving. He thinks there'll be a ruling before winter." He stretched his legs out. 7 ranches have filed claims against Pike's operation. Total disputed amount is over $3,000 across all the accounts. $3,000. Said plainly, it was a number. Felt fully, it was years of work taken from men who had earned it honestly. Will he have to pay it back? Maeve asked. Some of it. His operation is essentially done. He's lost all his major accounts, and his credit at the Merchants Trust has been suspended. Even if the court ruling is partial, he doesn't have the assets to continue. Ransom paused. He's left the territory, according to Hartwell. Packed up his household 2 weeks ago. Maeve thought about Orson Pike for a moment, not with satisfaction particularly. With something closer to the feeling you have when a storm has passed, and you're looking at what it left behind, a recognition of damage, a practical assessment of what needs doing next. And Silas? She asked. Still in the territory, working for a smaller operation south of the county line. Ransom looked at the middle distance. He's not the problem anymore. No, he wasn't. She thought about Silas occasionally. The way you think about the things that once threatened you when those things have been reduced to their actual size. He had been afraid and greedy, and he had made choices. And now he was working for a smaller operation south of the county line, and that was the life he'd built for himself. She did not wish him ill. She did not wish him anything in particular. She just didn't think about him much. The loan renewal went through its standard terms, Ransom said. Pruitt sent the formal confirmation. I know. I saw it on the desk. He glanced at her. You read my correspondence. The desk was open and I was walking past. A pause. I read anything that's visible. It's a reflex. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. I'm aware. I've started putting things face down. That helps, she admitted. He did laugh then, a quiet sound. The kind that's comfortable rather than performed. She had come to value that laugh, specifically, the one that came from something actually striking him as funny, not the social variant. It was a rarer thing in Ransom than the social variant would have been, and rarer things were worth more. Lenora deteriorated in the fall. It wasn't a sudden thing, it was the gradual thing that happens with aging bodies that have been under strain for a long time, the accumulated weight of a hard life, making itself known through the systems that had been compensating for years. The hip was worse. There was a tiredness that sleep didn't fully address. The doctor from Harlan Crossing came twice and was honest with them in the way good doctors are honest, which is without false comfort but also without drama. Lenora herself was unsentimental about it. I've had a full life, she told Maeve one afternoon, in the room off the kitchen that had been hers since the beginning. More full at the end than I expected. Don't talk like it's the end, Maeve said. I'm not saying it's tomorrow. I'm saying it's coming, and I'm not afraid of it. Lenora looked at her steadily. Are you going to be all right? The question landed the way certain questions land when they reverse the expected direction. Maeve was 33 years old, and her mother was asking whether she was going to be all right. Yes, she said. With him? Yes. Lenora looked at her for a moment. He's a good man. Not a perfect one. Good, I know. You were too smart for Thomas. You knew it, and you married him anyway, because you were 20 and 20 is when we make the decisions our 40-year-old selves have to live with. She paused. Ransom is different. He's not threatened by what you are. No, Maeve agreed, he isn't. That's rarer than people say it is. Lenora settled back against her pillow. All right, I just wanted to say that. She closed her eyes. Now go do something useful. You've been standing in my doorway for 10 minutes and I can feel you worrying. Maeve went and did something useful. She always did. Lenora lived through the winter. She lived to see the first anniversary of Hollister House, which by then had housed 11 women and 16 children across its first year, 7 of whom had moved into independent situations, 2 with paying work established. 1 remarried. 2 sharing housing in Harlan, crossing together with enough wages between them to manage. The others were still in process, which was the nature of the thing. Process was not failure. Process was what it looked like when something was actually happening. She lived to see Elena Garza's eldest start attending the Harlan Crossing schoolhouse, because Elena had saved enough by spring to cover the fees. She lived to see Danny Pruitt read a full page of the county register out loud in the kitchen, without stopping, and then look up at Maeve with the expression of someone who has just understood that a thing he'd decided was impossible was actually not impossible, just hard, and hard was manageable. Lenora died in March, in the room off the kitchen, with Maeve beside her, and the sound of the Blackthorn yard in the morning coming through the window horses, men's voices, the particular quality of a working ranch at the start of a day. She was 61 years old. She had survived more than most people knew about, and complained about less than was warranted, and she had lived long enough to see her daughter become someone the county's most powerful men had stood up in a room in Stoon and tried to erase, and had failed. Maeve held her hand when it was over, for a while, and then she got up and went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee, because there were 40-something men who needed breakfast, and the bread wasn't going to make itself. And grief was not something she had the luxury of being absent for very long. And she thought that Lenora, of all people, would have understood that. Ransom found her at the stove 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He came into the kitchen and stood near her, and that was all, just the physical fact of his presence in the room, and she was grateful for it in a way that didn't require words. And she thought that this was maybe the truest thing you could say about a good marriage, not the grand declarations, not the moments when things went well, but the specific person who shows up and stands near you in the kitchen when your mother has just died and you're making bread, because you don't know what else to do with your hands. She leaned against him for a moment, just a moment. Then she went back to the bread. The years after that moved the way years do when you've stopped waiting for your life to start, and recognized that it's already happening quickly in retrospect, fully in the living of them. Blackthorn grew. Not dramatically, not the way expansion happens in stories where everything doubles overnight, but incrementally, the way good things grow through consistent attention and honest labor, and the kind of management that doesn't make headlines because it's working correctly. Ransom focused on the cattle and the land. Maeve focused on the kitchen and the accounts in Hollister House, which by its third year had become something that people in the territory had an opinion about whether they'd ever visited it or not. The opinions divided roughly the way opinions about women who do unexpected things always divide. There were people who saw it as the obvious right thing, and people who thought it was admirable but peculiar, and people who were uncomfortable with it in ways they couldn't quite articulate, and so expressed as concerns about propriety. Maeve absorbed all three categories with equal equanimity, which was the equanimity of someone who had been decided upon by other people's opinions for so long that she had stopped expecting unanimity and had learned to work without it. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the 11-year-old boy who could read a full page without stopping, and the woman from South County who had been brittle when she arrived and left 2 years later, with a paying position in a Harsland Crossing seamstress shop, and something behind her eyes that looked cautiously like the beginning of solidity. What mattered was Clara Briggs, who had arrived saying she didn't think a place like this would actually exist, and who left after 18 months to take a position managing a boarding house in the next county, and who sent a letter back to Hollister House twice a year without fail, addressed to Mrs. Creed, which was what people called Maeve now, though she had never asked them to, and had never corrected them when they did. They had a daughter in the 4th year of their marriage. They named her Nora, which was close enough to Lenora that the meaning was clear to anyone paying attention, and which was also its own name for its own person, which mattered. Nora was nothing like Maeve had expected, which was the thing about children: you carry them for months and think you're preparing yourself, and then they arrive, and immediately demonstrate that your preparation was beside the point. She was loud and opinionated, and had Ransom's coloring and Maeve's eyes, and the particular stubbornness that appeared to have concentrated in her from both parents simultaneously. She followed Maeve around the kitchen from the time she could walk, demanding to know what everything was for. "What's that?" "A boning knife." "Don't touch it." "What's that?" "Cornmeal." "You've asked about it before." "What's that?" "My sanity. It's going fast." Ransom thought this was funnier than Maeve did, but even Maeve found it funny. Eventually, usually after the fact, when the day was done, and she was reconstructing it for him over coffee. Nora learned to read at 4. By 6, she was reading aloud to Lenora's old chair in the corner of the kitchen, which nobody had moved and nobody had discussed moving, with the unself-conscious conviction of a child who believes in the importance of what she's doing and does not yet know to be embarrassed about that. Maeve watched her sometimes from across the kitchen, this small, loud person, reading to an empty chair in the late afternoon light, and felt something that she had no adequate name for, something that was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but something larger and more compound, the feeling of a life that had turned out to be more than what she'd been able to see from the ground when the ground was bad. Vance left Blackthorn in the 5th year, not because anything was wrong, but because his wife in Abilene was unwell and his boys needed him present. He came to the kitchen the morning before he left and stood in the doorway the way men stand when they're trying to find words for something that's larger than their usual vocabulary. Creed, he said. Vance. He looked at his right hand for a moment, the one that curved inward. I've been thinking about something for a while. About when you first noticed. About the plate. He raised his eyes. You never said anything to anybody. You just adjusted it. It wasn't mine to say, Maeve said. I know. But you could have. The way some people would have made a thing of it, told the boss, used it as a way to seem he searched for the word considerate in front of an audience. That's not consideration, Maeve said. That's performance. Vance nodded slowly. I've thought about that difference a lot. He shifted. My boys are 16 and 13 now. I want them to understand that difference. That's the kind of thing I want them to know. He paused. I just thought you should know you're the one who showed it to me. She looked at him. There was nothing adequate to say to that, and she didn't try to say it. She just let it be what it was. Take care of yourself, she said. Have the hand looked at in Abilene. There are doctors there who work with the joints. I will. He left the next morning. She watched the horse go down the road and thought about the particular kind of mark that people leave when they pass through a life carefully, not monuments, not grand gestures, but the specific small adjustments that show up later in how a person moves through the world. Danny Pruitt stayed. By the time he was 20, he was doing the ranch's primary account records, which Maeve had gradually handed over to him as his reading and arithmetic came fully into their own. He was meticulous and honest and occasionally brilliant in the way that people are brilliant when they've had to work harder to get to the starting line than other people and have used that extra effort to understand things at a level that easier access might not have required. He never talked about the kitchen lessons directly. But once when he was 18 or 19 and was working at the ranch office desk, he told Hectatskaza within Maeve's hearing that he'd learned everything he knew about keeping records from Mrs. Creed, and that it was the most useful thing anyone had ever taught him. Hector had looked at Maeve with the face of a man who had been watching this particular development with private satisfaction for years. Maeve had said nothing. She'd taken the dried beans off the shelf and started sorting them. This is what Maeve Hollister Creed understood by the time Blackthorn's reputation had grown beyond its cattle and its wealthy owner and become something else, something harder to categorize and more durable. That the world has a specific set of opinions about what a woman who looks like her is capable of, and those opinions are wrong, but they are also not going away on their own. And the only thing that actually changes them, slowly and with effort and without guarantee, is the visible record of the work itself. Not argument, not defense, the work. That respect earned through performance is not the same as respect freely given, and the difference matters. And it is simultaneously true that earned respect is more solid, and that no person should have to earn what should be given at the start, and holding both of those truths at once, without letting either erase the other is the actual work of living in the world as it is, while believing in the world as it should be. That a kitchen is not a small thing. It is where people are fed, which is where people are sustained, which is where the actual work of keeping a community alive happens every single day, without headline or ceremony. And the person who runs that kitchen is not a background figure. She is, in the most literal possible sense, the person keeping everyone else on their feet. That the man who offers you respect before the world decides you deserve it is offering you something rarer and more valuable than the man who offers it after. And that love, real love, the kind that holds the whole person and not a convenient portion of them, is not something that happens to you. It is something you recognize when you've been careful enough and still enough and present enough to see it clearly when it arrives. That you do not have to make yourself smaller to fit a world that finds your full size inconvenient. The world is large enough for what you are, and if the portion of it where you currently stand is not, then you build the portion that can hold you, and you let other people stand in it too, because you know what it cost you to need somewhere to stand. Maeve kept the cast iron skillet on a hook beside the stove, in the same position it had occupied since her first week at Blackthorn. It was not decorative. She used it most mornings. It was heavy and old and slightly uneven on its base, which meant it required a specific placement on the heat to cook evenly, and you had to know that about it or it would burn one side of whatever you were making. Nora knew that about it by the time she was 7. Cowboys who had been at Blackthorn from the beginning, Those who remained told the newer hands about that first morning, the way stories get told when they've had enough time to settle into their true shape. About the 6 men laughing, and the woman who looked at Silas Vane without blinking and put his breakfast on the table and said what she said. The story changed slightly with each telling, the way stories do. In some versions, there were more men laughing. In some versions, Silas had said something worse than what he'd actually said. In all versions, Maeve was exactly as she had actually been, not larger than life, not softened, not made into something more comfortable or more digestible than the real thing. She was a woman who showed up with a skillet and her mother in a wagon seat and 30 days to prove something to a yard full of people who had already decided she couldn't. And she proved it. And then she proved more. And then she built something on 12 acres of unused land and a foundation of meticulous records and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided that this time, this place, was going to be different, not because the world had decided to be fair, but because she was going to make it hard for the world to justify being otherwise. On the 10th anniversary of her arrival at Blackthorn, someone she never found out who hung a second hook beside the stove, identical to the one that held her skillet, and on that hook they had placed a small handwritten card that read, Mrs. Creed's Kitchen, established 1887. She left it there. She thought Lenora would have laughed at it. In that particular way her mother had of laughing at things that were also true. She thought Ransom would say it was sentimental, and probably leave it there too. Which was the thing about Ransom, he was practical, in ways that knew when practicality was beside the point. She was right on both counts. She kept cooking. She kept the records. Kept showing up before the sun did. Because the fire didn't light itself, and the bread didn't start itself, and the 40-something men who had once laughed and had long since stopped laughing were going to need feeding before dawn, the same as they always had. Some things don't change because they don't need to. Some things change everything. Maeve Hollister Creed had spent enough of her life learning the difference to know, now, which was which. And she was not finished yet.